Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through boring history. I hope this evening, or perhaps it's morning where you are, or a quiet afternoon finds you comfortable, settled into your favourite listening spot. Before we begin tonight's exploration, I'd like to ask, where are you right now? Are you tucked beneath blankets, the world outside your window dark and still? Perhaps you're in a chair, the soft glow of a lamp the only light in the room. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you're here for a reason. Maybe it's been one of those days, the kind that leaves your mind spinning long after it should have quieted. Or perhaps you simply find comfort in the steady rhythm of historical detail, the kind of thorough, methodical examination that lets other thoughts fade away. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been with us before, welcome back. And if you find value in these long, detailed journeys through history's unglamorous corners, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. Not for my sake, but so you can find your way back when you need another night of boring history. Tonight, we're examining something popular culture gets spectacularly, almost comically wrong. How Vikings actually used their weapons in battle. Not the spinning axes and dramatic sword duels you've seen in films. Not the berserkers charging shirtless through enemy lines, immune to pain and fear. Not the heroic last stands where warriors cleave through dozens of foes before falling in glorious slow motion. Instead, we'll explore what archaeology and historical sources actually tell us about Viking Age combat. And I promise you, it's far less cinematic and far more disturbing than anything Hollywood has produced. Picture, if you will, not warriors but exhausted farmers, standing shoulder to shoulder in suffocating human walls, jabbing spears over shields in monotonous repetition until their arms burned and someone, anyone, broke and ran. Imagine not instant heroic death but shallow accumulating wounds, infection setting in days later, dying slowly in a wool tunic soaked with your own blood. This is the reality we'll examine tonight across 25 chapters of methodical, unglamorous detail. So settle in, dear listener. Let the outside world fade, and let us turn to the truth about Viking weapons, a truth far darker and far more boring than the myths we've built around them. We're speaking of Scandinavia during what historians call the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1060 CE, though those dates are somewhat arbitrary, marking the Lindisfarne raid at one end and the Battle of Stamford Bridge at the other, as if violence and culture stopped neatly at calendar boundaries. The geography matters more than the dates. We're talking about a landscape of fjords and forests, mountains and marginal farmland, a place where the growing season was short and the winters were brutal. Population density was low. Modern estimates suggest perhaps 1 to 2 million people across, all of Norway, Sweden and Denmark combined, scattered in small settlements along coasts and river valleys. This wasn't a centralised empire with professional armies and standardised equipment. This was a collection of scattered communities, family groups, petty kingdoms, each operating with whatever resources they could scrape together from the unforgiving northern soil. The climate shapes everything we'll discuss tonight. Iron production required charcoal, which required trees, which required labour. In regions with better forest access, more iron meant better weapons, but even then, better is relative. The iron produced from bog ore in Scandinavia was often poor quality, requiring repeated heating and hammering to achieve anything approaching the carbon content needed for effective weapons. Some iron was imported, traded south from richer mining regions, but this only the wealthy could afford, so when we talk about Viking weapons, we're already talking about a stratified system where geography and economics determined what you carried into battle. A farmer in coastal Norway might own a spear made from local bog iron, serviceable but prone to bending. A jarl in Denmark might possess a sword with imported Frankish steel, pattern welded for prestige, though not necessarily more effective for all that expense and artistry. The archaeological sites that inform our understanding are scattered across this landscape and beyond, wherever Vikings fought and died. Some are famous. The mass grave at Visby in Gotland, containing over 200 bodies from a 1361 battle, many still wearing mail armour that didn't save them. The Ridgeway Hill execution site in Dorset, England, where 54 young men, likely Vikings, were systematically beheaded and buried in a mass grave. The cemetery at Repton in Derbyshire, where a Viking army overwintered in 873-874, leaving behind 264 burials and evidence of violent death. These sites give us something sagas and poetry cannot: the actual bones, the actual wounds, the actual evidence of how weapons were used on human bodies. Skeletal remains don't lie. They don't exaggerate for dramatic effect. They don't create heroes from cowards or glorious deaths from ugly ones. A skull split by an axe is a skull split by an axe, and we can measure the wound, analyse the angle, understand the force required. This is how we know the truth about Viking combat. Not from stories written centuries later by people who weren't there, but from the bones of those who were. The Viking warrior you picture in your mind, tall, muscular, clad in chainmail and horned helmet, wielding a massive battle axe with casual grace, is a fiction. Not just inaccurate, but completely fabricated, assembled from pieces of 19th century romanticism, Wagnerian opera, and modern cinema's need for visual drama. The horned helmet, for instance, has no archaeological basis whatsoever. None. Not a single Viking Age helmet has been found with horns. The iconic image comes from 1870s costume design and early 20th century illustrators who thought it looked appropriately barbaric. The massive axes you see in films, wood-cutting tools, not battle weapons. The dramatic dueling never happened in the formation-based warfare that actually characterised the period. We have built an entire mythology around Viking warriors that archaeology and careful historical analysis has systematically dismantled. Yet the myths persist because they're more exciting than reality. Where did these myths come from? The 19th century bears much of the blame. As European nationalism rose, various nations sought heroic ancestors, and Vikings fit the bill nicely. Fierce, independent, adventurous. Never mind that these same Vikings spent much of their time trading, farming, and settling legal disputes through arbitration. Richard Wagner's opera cycle, particularly its depiction of Valkyries and warrior culture, cemented the image of the superhuman Norse warrior in popular imagination. By the early 20th century, illustrators like N.C. Wyeth were creating images of massive, noble Vikings that looked more like idealized Germanic warriors than the reality of early medieval Scandinavian farmers who occasionally went raiding. Cinema took these fabrications and ran with them, because dramatic sword duels make better viewing than the reality of exhausted men jabbing spears over shields until someone collapsed from fatigue. The actual sources we have for Viking Age warfare are limited and problematic. Saga literature, those sweeping tales of heroes and battles, sounds authoritative until you remember most were written in the 13th and 14th centuries, 200 to 300 years after the events they describe. They're valuable as cultural documents, showing what later medieval Icelanders thought about their ancestors, but they're terrible as military history. They're full of dramatic duels, heroic last stands, and supernatural interventions that tell us more about literary conventions than actual combat. The contemporary sources are better but sparse. Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Frankish annals, Byzantine accounts, all written by outsiders describing Vikings as enemies, which brings its own biases. Where we find truth is in the material remains, the weapons buried in graves, the defensive wounds on skeletons, the archaeological evidence of fortifications and battlefield sites. And increasingly, in experimental archaeology, where modern researchers try to fight with period-accurate replicas and discover just how quickly medieval weapons exhaust you, how shields absorb impact, how iron swords bend under stress. These sources tell a consistent story, and it's nothing like the movies. Real Viking Age combat was nothing like popular culture depicts. There were no dramatic one-on-one sword duels with warriors circling each other, trading clever blows like choreographed dances. There were no berserkers charging alone through enemy lines, impervious to weapons cleaving through dozens of foes. There were no warriors casually dual-wielding axes, spinning and slicing with impossible grace. What there was, dear listener, was this: exhausted men standing in packed formations, so close they could smell each other's fear sweat, jabbing spears over the rims of wooden shields in monotonous, repetitive motions, until their arms burned and their grips weakened. The violence was brief, often just minutes of actual combat after hours of tense standoff. The killing was ugly, accumulating wounds, men bleeding out slowly, infection setting in days later to finish what the spear thrust started. The equipment was often poor quality. Swords that bent, spears that broke, shields that splintered, mail armour that most couldn't afford. The truth is one of monotonous brutality punctuated by moments of absolute terror. Most warriors were farmers, conscripted or obligated by social ties, with minimal training and whatever weapons they could afford or borrow. They stood in shield walls because that's what you did, because breaking and running meant being cut down from behind, because there was no alternative between standing with your community or abandoning it. Most died not from heroic combat, but from being too poor to afford good armour, too exhausted to keep their shield up, too unlucky to avoid the spear thrust that punctured something vital. And if they survived the initial wound, they faced weeks of potential infection, fever, gangrenous rot, dying slowly in ways that make instant death in battle look merciful by comparison. Tonight, across 25 chapters of methodical detail, we'll examine how Viking Age weapons were actually used. We'll start with the myths: dual-wielding axes, universal sword ownership, berserker fury, and dismantle them with archaeological evidence. We'll examine the economics of warfare, how class determined what weapons you could afford and therefore your chances of survival. We'll look at the actual techniques of combat, the shield wall, the spear thrust, the exhausting reality of swinging heavy weapons until your muscles failed. We'll examine what wounds actually looked like, what skeletal remains tell us about how men died, what happened to survivors. We'll consider the psychology of standing in battle line while friends died beside you, the sound and smell of medieval combat, the unglamorous aftermath of looting corpses and killing the wounded. By the end, you'll understand why Hollywood gets it so wrong, and why the truth, unglamorous, exhausting, terrifying, is far more disturbing than any cinematic fantasy. So let us begin with perhaps the most pervasive myth of all: the image of Viking warriors spinning two axes simultaneously, a fantasy so mechanically impossible it's almost comical. Almost. Chapter 1. The Myth of Dual-Wielding Axes. Let us begin with one of cinema's favourite images: the Viking warrior wielding two axes simultaneously, spinning and slicing through enemies with balletic grace, each axe finding its mark as if guided by supernatural force. You've seen this in films, in television series, in video games, the iconic dual-wielding berserker, axes whirling in complex patterns, cutting down foes who seem to obligingly wait their turn to be struck. It's visually spectacular. It's dramatically satisfying. It's also completely, utterly impossible, and no archaeological or historical evidence suggests it ever happened during the Viking Age. Not once, not anywhere. The myth of dual-wielding axes is perhaps the perfect example of how popular culture prioritizes visual excitement over the brutal, boring mathematics of medieval combat. Picture, if you will, what dual-wielding actually requires. First, both weapons must be light enough to wield one-handed with speed and control. Viking Age axes varied in weight, but even smaller war axes weighed 2 to 3 pounds, lighter than you'd think until you've swung one repeatedly. Hold a 3-pound weight at arm's length and wave it around for 60 seconds. Your arm burns, doesn't it? Now do it with both arms, while maintaining enough control to aim at moving targets who are actively trying to kill you, while also watching for incoming attacks you cannot block because you're not carrying a shield. The physics alone make it absurd. But there's more. The biomechanics of swinging axes require rotation from the hips and shoulders, full body movements that generate force. You cannot generate proper striking force with one hand while the other hand is doing something different. Martial artists and experimental archaeologists who've tested this report the same findings. Dual-wielding looks impressive in slow motion, but generates weak, poorly controlled strikes that would bounce off shields or armour without causing significant damage. What makes this truly brutal, though, what reveals the dark reality beneath the fantasy, is this: any warrior who attempted to fight without a shield died quickly and horribly. We know this from skeletal remains. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age combat injuries shows consistent patterns. Warriors without shields suffered devastating head and shoulder wounds. The left side of the skull and left shoulder are where we find the worst trauma, exactly where a shield would normally protect. The evidence is overwhelming. Shields weren't optional equipment or something heroes discarded to look impressive. They were essential survival tools, the difference between living and dying. A warrior without a shield was exposed to every spear thrust, every sword cut, every axe blow, and the human skull is remarkably vulnerable. We find skeletal remains with multiple weapon strikes to the head, deep cuts into cranial bone, blunt force trauma that crushed facial structures. These weren't warriors who died heroically. These were men whose protection failed or who foolishly fought without it. There's a burial at Repton that illustrates this perfectly. Among the mass grave of the Viking overwintering army, archaeologists found the remains of a warrior in his 20s with extensive defensive wounds, cuts on his forearms where he'd raised them to protect his head, deep cuts to his shoulder and neck, multiple blows to the skull. The pattern tells a story. This man lost his shield, probably knocked from his grip during combat. He raised his arms to protect himself, and the blows came anyway, cutting through flesh and striking bone. He likely survived the initial battle. Some of the wounds show early signs of healing, but died within days, probably from infection or blood loss. He was buried with his community, which suggests he was valued, but his bones tell us he made a fatal error. Fighting without proper protection. This is what dual wielding actually means. Trading the one piece of equipment that keeps you alive for the ability to swing a second weapon that experimental archaeology proves is less effective than a single weapon used properly. So the next time you see a film depicting dual-wielding Vikings, remember this: it's visual fantasy, created because spinning axes look exciting. Reality was a man standing behind a wooden shield, jabbing a spear over the rim with economical motions, keeping protected because survival mattered more than looking impressive. The real Viking warriors understood what cinema forgets. You cannot look heroic if you're dead, and you die very quickly without a shield. The mathematics of medieval combat were brutal and boring. Stay behind your protection, use your weapon efficiently, don't expose yourself unnecessarily. Not cinematic, not exciting. But effective, at least until your shield broke or your arm tired, or the man beside you fell and someone stepped into the gap, and suddenly the spear was coming at you from an angle you couldn't block, and everything you'd done to stay alive stopped mattering. We'll return to that moment later. For now, simply understand, dual-wielding axes is fantasy, and fantasy gets you killed. Chapter 2. Why most Vikings fought with spears, not swords. We need to talk about economics. Not exciting, I know, but economics shaped Viking Age warfare more than courage or skill. Here's the fundamental reality. Swords required pounds of high-quality iron and the services of a skilled smith who knew how to forge weld different iron types into a functional blade. The process took days of work: heating, hammering, folding, shaping, hardening, tempering. A finished sword represented enormous investment of materials and labour, costing as much as a small farm. In a society where most people lived at subsistence level, where one bad harvest meant hunger, where wealth was measured in livestock and land, a sword was a luxury item accessible only to the wealthy. Meanwhile, a spearhead required ounces of iron, literally ounces compared to the pounds a sword demanded, and basic blacksmithing skills. Any competent village smith could forge a spear point. The shaft was even simpler. A straight piece of ash wood, maybe 6 to 8 feet long, fitted to the socket of the spearhead. Total cost: perhaps a week's wages for a farmer. A sword cost months or years of income. Archaeological surveys confirm what economics predicts. Spears vastly outnumber swords in grave goods. Depending on the region and period, excavations find 10 to 20 spears for every sword. Sometimes the ratio is even more dramatic. We're not talking about slight preference. We're talking about swords being rare prestige objects, while spears were the standard infantry weapon. Saga literature reflects this despite its heroic focus. When armies are described, they're forests of spears, not glittering swords. Even wealthy warriors often carried spears as primary weapons, keeping their expensive swords as backups. The Carolingian Franks, who fought Vikings repeatedly, had laws requiring all free men to own spears and shields, but only the wealthy needed swords. This wasn't unique to Scandinavia. It was the basic military economics of early medieval Europe. Metal was expensive, skilled smithing was expensive, and swords required both in quantities that most people couldn't afford. The dark truth lurking beneath these numbers is this: most warriors knew their equipment was inferior to what wealthy opponents carried. Imagine standing in a battle line holding your 6-foot ash spear with its serviceable but unexceptional iron point. looking across at enemy warriors whose spear points gleam with quality steel, whose shields are reinforced with better fittings, who wear mail armour that cost more than your entire family owns. You know that if it comes to direct combat, their advantages matter. Their spear might pierce your shield while yours bends against theirs. Their armour stops your thrust while you wear only wool that stops nothing. Class determined survival chances in ways that courage couldn't overcome. Being brave with a poor spear didn't make you equal to a wealthy warrior with quality equipment. It made you a brave corpse. The archaeological evidence supports this grim reality. Graves with wealthy goods show warriors who survived to old age, honoured burials, evidence of long careers. Graves with minimal goods often show young men with violent trauma, single battles that ended their lives. There's a passage in the Laxdealer saga that captures this perfectly. A warrior named Bolli needs a weapon for an upcoming fight. He borrows a sword, the sword fotbiter, meaning leg biter, from a relative. Before the battle, the relative demands the sword back, offering a lesser weapon instead. Bolli has no choice but to accept. The saga frames this as dishonourable, but notice what it reveals. Warriors borrowed weapons they couldn't afford to own, and ownership mattered enough that a relative could demand back a loaned sword even at a critical moment. Bolli fights with the inferior replacement and survives, but the saga treats the incident as shameful, not for Bolli, but for the relative whose greed endangered kinsmen. The story only makes sense in a world where weapon quality was scarce, where economics trumped honour, where not everyone could afford the tools their lives depended on. So when we picture Viking Age warriors, we shouldn't imagine everyone carrying gleaming swords. We should picture farmers carrying spears, serviceable, affordable, adequate tools that wouldn't fail immediately but wouldn't inspire much confidence either. The spear wasn't a choice for most, it was economic necessity. You carried a spear because you couldn't afford anything better, because your status meant you got the minimum equipment required, because warfare was something that interrupted farming, not a profession that justified investment in expensive weapons. And you went into battle hoping the man across from you was equally poor, equally ill-equipped, because if he was wealthy, if his equipment was better, then courage and skill might not matter. Economics would determine who lived and who died, and no amount of bravery changes the fact that good equipment cost money most people didn't have. Chapter 3. The truth about Viking swords. Expensive, heavy, impractical. Let's discuss what swords actually were, stripped of mythology. In popular culture, the Viking sword is an object of near magical perfection, perfectly balanced, razor sharp, light as a feather yet strong as steel, carried effortlessly by warriors who swing them all day without fatigue. The pattern-welded blades with their distinctive watery patterns are described as the height of medieval metallurgy, superior to simple iron swords in every way. Even the names given to swords in sagas, Tyrfinger, Grammar, Skofnung, suggest objects of such quality they acquire personality. Cinema reinforces this. Swords that slice through armour, cut through shields, never bend or break no matter how much abuse they endure. It's a compelling fantasy. It's also largely false. Real Viking Age swords were expensive, heavy, often poorly made despite the expense, and surprisingly impractical for extended combat. Let's start with weight. A typical Viking Age sword weighed between 2 and 3 pounds. That doesn't sound like much, does it? Hold a 3-pound weight in your hand, it's nothing. Now extend your arm and hold that weight at arm's length for 60 seconds. Your arm starts burning within 30 seconds. The weight hasn't changed, but leverage means the force your muscles must exert increases dramatically with distance from your body. Now swing that weight over and over, using full body rotation to generate cutting force, while also maintaining guard position, while watching for incoming attacks, while dealing with adrenaline and fear and exhaustion. Experimental archaeology with period-accurate replica swords shows that even fit modern practitioners experience significant arm fatigue within 5 to 10 minutes of active combat simulation. Your grip weakens, your cuts lose force, your guard drops. Historical battles probably didn't last long in terms of active weapon swinging. Precisely because human physiology has limits, medieval warriors couldn't exceed through toughness or courage. Pattern welding deserves special attention because it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of Viking swords. Yes, pattern welded swords are beautiful. The characteristic watery or twisted patterns created by forge welding together different types of iron and steel, are visually stunning. Yes, they were expensive, requiring days of skilled labour to create, and yes, saga literature prizes them, describing pattern-welded blades as heirlooms passed through generations. But here's what modern metallurgical analysis reveals. Pattern welding was primarily decorative, not functional. The technique was developed centuries earlier when quality steel was rare, and forge welding different iron sources together could create blades with decent properties. By the Viking Age, better metallurgy was available, and simple blades made from consistent carbon steel actually performed better than pattern-welded ones. Modern tests using replica swords show pattern-welded blades are more prone to internal weaknesses, where the different metals join, more likely to develop stress fractures, and no sharper or stronger than well-made simple blades. The pattern welding was status display. I'm so wealthy I can afford a sword made using expensive ancient techniques, not functional superiority. What makes this truly brutal is how often swords failed their owners when needed most. Archaeological finds and saga accounts both reference the same disturbing reality. Swords bent. Iron and low-carbon steel, especially the quality available in Scandinavia, can deform under the stress of striking hard targets like shields, armour or bone. There are saga accounts of warriors having to stop mid-battle, place their bent sword under their foot, and manually bend it straight again before continuing to fight. The Mastermere find, a 10th century tool chest discovered in Gotland, contained among its contents several broken swords and sword fragments, suggesting either battlefield salvage or swords brought to a smith for repair. These weren't decorative pieces, these were actual combat weapons that had failed, their blades cracked or bent beyond field repair. Imagine the psychological horror. You've invested enormous wealth in this weapon, maybe a family heirloom, the symbol of your warrior status. In the moment you need it most, when your life depends on it, the blade bends or breaks, and suddenly you're holding expensive scrap metal while enemies close in. It's hard not to feel sympathy for Viking Age warriors when you understand this reality. The wealthiest men in their communities, the ones who could afford the prestige symbol of a sword, still carried weapons that might fail them catastrophically. The farmer, his cheap spear at least knew what he had, a simple tool that would probably work adequately. The sword owner had invested enormous resources for a weapon that, yes, had better reach and cutting power than alternatives, but also might betray him when it mattered most. So the next time you see a film hero effortlessly cutting through enemies with a perfect sword that never dulls or bends, remember, real swords were heavy enough to exhaust you within minutes. Pattern welding was expensive decoration rather than functional improvement, and the best swords available could still bend or break when you needed them most. Even wealth couldn't buy certainty in Viking Age warfare, just slightly better odds and much more expensive failures. Chapter 4. Shields, the most important weapon. No one talks about. Here's something peculiar about most popular depictions of Viking warriors. Shields are either absent or treated as minor props, something heroes discard to look more impressive before the real fighting begins. You see bare-chested warriors, or warriors carrying swords in both hands, or dramatic poses where the shield is held to the side for aesthetic purposes rather than protection. Cinema treats shields as defensive equipment, which sounds obvious, but the implication is that they're passive, unglamorous, less interesting than weapons that cut and stab. This is spectacularly wrong. Shields weren't just defense, they were arguably the most important piece of equipment any warrior carried, the difference between life and death, and they were active offensive weapons used to punch, shove, crush, and create openings for thrusts. Archaeological evidence makes this clear. Shields appear in virtually every warrior burial where organic material survived, found more consistently than any other piece of equipment including weapons. When a man was buried as a warrior, he was buried with his shield, because without it he wasn't a warrior, he was just a corpse waiting to happen. Viking Age shields were remarkably simple in construction, which is part of why they were universal. Wooden planks edge-glued together to form a round board roughly 30 to 36 inches in diameter, sometimes covered with leather for weather protection, with an iron boss in the centre protecting the hand grip. The grip was a horizontal bar across the centre opening, allowing the fist to punch forward through the boss hole. This design, round shield with central grip, goes back centuries and persisted because it worked. The round shape had no weak corners like rectangular shields. The central grip allowed the shield to be manoeuvred quickly, rotated to intercept attacks from any angle. This size was optimal, large enough to protect the torso and most of the head, small enough to not be unwieldy, and the simplicity meant every community could make them. You didn't need sophisticated metalworking, just basic carpentry, and an iron boss that any village smith could forge. Archaeological. Find show shields in graves of all wealth levels, from lavish chieftain burials to simple warrior graves with minimal goods. Everyone had shields because everyone needed shields. But here's what popular culture misses entirely. Shields weren't just held passively to absorb blows, they were active weapons. The iron boss wasn't just hand protection, it was a striking surface for shield punches. The rim could be used to hook enemy shields or strike faces. The whole shield could be driven forward to shove opponents, creating space or driving them back. Most importantly, shields were used together in coordinated formations, the famous shield wall, where overlapping shields created a unified barrier that protected everyone. Archaeological evidence for shield use as offensive weapons comes from skeletal remains. We find crushed cheekbones, broken noses, fractured jaws, trauma consistent with being struck by the boss of a shield, swung like a short-range weapon. The Gotlandic picture stones, carved stone monuments from the Viking Age showing battle scenes, depict warriors with shields held close to bodies, actively engaging, not held passively out to one side like props. The shields are central to the action, not accessories to it. There's a particular type of injury that appears repeatedly in Viking Age skeletal remains. Facial trauma with distinctive round impact patterns, approximately the diameter of a shield boss. These aren't cutting wounds from blades or penetrating wounds from points. They're blunt force trauma from something circular and hard smashed into faces with considerable force. We find fractured eye sockets, collapsed nasal bones, broken cheekbones, sometimes multiple fractures suggesting the victim was struck several times. These injuries match perfectly with shield boss punches, and they tell us something important. Shield-on-shield combat was close, brutal, and involved using the shield itself as a weapon. Imagine the technique. Enemy warrior raises his weapon to strike. You drive your shield forward into his face, the iron boss crunching into his nose or cheekbone, stunning him long enough for your spear hand to find an opening. Or you've locked shields with an opponent, your faces inches apart, and you headbutt your shield into his face, using your body weight to drive the boss through his teeth. Not heroic, not cinematic, but effective. It's sobering to think about what this means for the warrior experience. Your shield wasn't some passive barrier you hid behind. It was an active tool requiring strength and technique to use effectively. You needed to know when to absorb impacts by giving with the shield, when to deflect blows by angling it, when to punch forward with the boss, when to hook enemy shields to create openings. You needed the arm strength to hold it up for extended periods. Experimental archaeology shows shield arm fatigue is a major limiting factor in medieval combat simulation, with participants' left arms failing before their weapon arms. And you needed to coordinate with the warriors beside you, overlapping shields properly, maintaining formation, not leaving gaps. The shield determined whether you lived or died more than any other piece of equipment, yet popular culture treats it as an afterthought, something in the way of dramatic weapon work. Real warriors knew better. They knew the shield was the foundation of survival, and everything else, spear thrust, sword cut, axe blow, happened from behind its protection. Without it, you were exposed, vulnerable, and very shortly dead. Chapter 5. The absence of armour, most fought in wool and leather. Let's shatter another persistent image. The mail-clad Viking warrior, armoured from head to knee, the clink of chainmail accompanying every movement, helmets gleaming in sunlight. Popular culture loves armour because it looks impressive and signals wealth and status. What popular culture doesn't tell you, what archaeology makes brutally clear, is that mail armour appears in roughly 1 to 2% of Viking Age warrior burials. 1 to 2%. Not most warriors, not even many warriors. A tiny elite fraction of the wealthiest men, the ones who could afford what represented months or years of a skilled armourer's labour. The overwhelming majority of Viking Age fighters went into battle wearing what they wore every day. Wool tunics, maybe leather jerkins if they were fortunate. Wool trousers, leather shoes or boots. No metal protection, no hardened leather. Just fabric and hope. and the knowledge that any weapon that connected would cut right through. The numbers are stark when you examine grave goods systematically. Archaeological surveys of Viking Age burials across Scandinavia find mail fragments in only a small percentage of warrior graves. Estimates range from 1 to 3% depending on region and time period. Helmets are even rarer, with only a handful of complete Viking Age helmets surviving, most from lavish high-status burials. What the vast majority of burials show is weapons, spears mostly, some axes, occasional swords, and shields, but no body armour at all. The absence isn't because armour didn't survive. When mail is present, it preserves reasonably well in the right soil conditions, and we find it in enough graves to know what we're looking for. The absence is because most men didn't own armour. They couldn't afford it. Mail shirts, Bernie in Old Norse, required tens of thousands of individual iron rings, each formed, linked and riveted closed by hand. Modern craftsmen working with period techniques estimate hundreds of hours of labour for a single mail shirt. The cost was prohibitive for anyone below the higher social ranks. What makes this absolutely brutal is the vulnerability it created. Wool, even thick, tightly woven wool, provides essentially no protection against edged weapons. Spear points penetrated easily. Sword blades cut through it. Axe edges slice it open. Archaeological experiments with replica weapons and period textiles confirm what the skeletal evidence already tells us. Wool stops nothing. Maybe it provides minimal protection against glancing blows that might otherwise cause shallow cuts, but against direct strikes with any force behind them, you might as well be naked. Leather is marginally better. Thick, hardened leather can sometimes stop or deflect light cuts, but it's still wildly inadequate against determined attack. Yet this is what most warriors wore. Layers of wool, perhaps a leather jerkin if they were relatively prosperous, and nothing more between their skin and enemy weapons. Every thrust, every cut, every blow that connected had a high probability of penetrating straight to flesh and bone. The skeletal evidence is unambiguous and disturbing. When we examine remains from battle sites and warrior burials showing weapon trauma, we find cut marks and penetration wounds on the bones themselves. The weapons went through fabric, through flesh, and marked the skeleton underneath. Specific examples haunt you once you know them. The mass grave at Ridgeway Hill shows multiple individuals with deep cuts to vertebrae, clean slices through neck bones, blade marks on ribs and long bones, all consistent with weapons meeting minimal or no resistance from clothing before striking bone. One particularly disturbing burial from Repton shows a warrior with a spear wound that penetrated ribs and presumably vital organs, the point driven so deep it left a mark on the inside of a rib. No armour slowed it. Nothing protected him. The spear went through his wool tunic like it wasn't there, because functionally it wasn't. There's a saga account, I believe it's in Njal's saga, describing a warrior opened from shoulder to hip by a single sword cut. The phrasing isn't poetic exaggeration when you understand that wool provides no meaningful protection. A sharp sword swung with force by a strong man against an armoured target wearing only fabric. Yes, you can split a body open like that. It's hard not to imagine the psychological toll of standing in battle line in wool clothing, knowing you're essentially unprotected. You can see enemy warriors across from you, some in mail that glints even on overcast days, walking evidence that wealth buys protection you don't have. You can feel every breeze through your tunic, air passing freely through the weave, and you know that's how easily weapons will pass through. You've probably seen wounds before. If you're of fighting age in Viking Age Scandinavia, you've seen hunting accidents, farming injuries, casual violence. You know what sharp objects do to human bodies, and you're standing in formation waiting for violence you cannot adequately protect against, where your survival depends on your shield not breaking, your arm not tiring, the man beside you not falling and leaving you exposed. The lucky few in mail might survive wounds that would kill you. They might shrug off the spear thrust that punctures your lung. Class determines survival in ways courage cannot overcome, and you're very aware you're on the wrong side of that equation. But you stand anyway, because breaking and running means being cut down from behind, because your community needs bodies in the line, because this is simply what men did. Not because they were braver than we are, but because they had no choice and less protection than we can easily imagine. Chapter 6. Shield Wall. Reality standing shoulder to shoulder for hours. The shield wall is the defining tactical formation of Viking Age and early medieval warfare. You've heard of it. You've seen Hollywood's versions of it, but what you probably haven't considered is what it actually felt like to stand in one for hours at a time. Not the brief cinematic version where warriors charge, clash, and the battle resolves in minutes. The reality, long periods of tense standoff, men packed shoulder to shoulder so tightly they could barely move, waiting for someone to make the first move, trying to maintain discipline while terror gnawed at resolve. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts from Viking Age battles and similar period warfare suggest that battles were often hours of psychological warfare, punctuated by minutes of actual violence. The waiting was part of the tactic: exhaust the enemy's nerve before exhausting their bodies. And during that wait you stood in formation, pressed against the men beside you, breathing their breath, smelling their fear. Let us be specific about the physical configuration. A shield wall wasn't a loose line of men standing near each other. It was a compressed human mass, shields overlapping, each warrior's right side protected by his neighbour's shield, because your own shield covered your left side and centre. This meant standing close enough that your right shoulder pressed against the left shoulder of the man beside you, close enough to feel his breathing, his trembling if he was afraid, his body heat even on cold days. The shields overlapped by perhaps 6 inches to a foot, creating a continuous barrier with minimal gaps. This compression was essential. Gaps in the shield wall were death, places where enemy spears could thrust through. So you stood pressed together and you waited. Historical accounts from similar medieval battles suggest standoffs lasting hours. The Anglo-Saxon poem describing the Battle of Maldon, fought in 991 CE against Vikings, describes the armies facing each other across a tidal causeway, waiting for the tide to recede enough to allow combat. Hours of waiting, watching, maintaining formation. What makes this truly brutal? What the sagas don't emphasise and cinema doesn't show is the claustrophobic psychological horror of it. You couldn't move. Your shield arm was locked in position, pressed against your neighbour's shields. Your weapon arm was similarly constrained, room only for short thrusting or jabbing. Motions. You couldn't step back without breaking formation, couldn't advance without the whole line advancing, so you stood, and the pressure of being unable to flee, unable to do anything but wait for violence you couldn't prevent, worked on your mind. Men soiled themselves while standing in shield walls. There are references in various medieval sources to the smell of loosened bowels during battles, stated matter-of-factly as part of the experience. Your bladder and bowels respond to extreme fear whether you want them to or not, and when you cannot leave formation, when you're pressed against other men in the same state of terror, the physical reality becomes part of the psychological assault. The violence, when it came, brought different horrors. Shield walls didn't usually break through sword skill or individual heroism. They broke through collective shoving, one formation physically pushing the other backward until cohesion failed. This meant crush injuries, men in the middle of the formation pressed so tightly between advancing enemies and their own ranks behind them that ribs broke. Breathing became impossible. There are accounts from later medieval battles of men suffocating while standing upright, crushed between the press of bodies. And when someone fell, whether from wounds, exhaustion, or being shoved down, they were trampled. Their own side trampled them. Skeletal remains from battle sites show trampling injuries, broken bones from being stepped on, crushed skulls from boots driven down by the weight of men above. The Battle of Visby in 1361, later than our period but using similar tactics, shows evidence of this in the mass graves. Some bodies have injuries consistent with being trampled while alive or freshly dead, bones broken by compression forces rather than weapon strikes. It's difficult to overstate how this challenges our heroic narratives about medieval warfare. Standing in a shield wall wasn't glorious. It was being unable to move, pressed between the man in front of you and the man behind you, breathing air thick with body odour and fear stink and the smell of men who'd lost control of their bowels. It was waiting while your arm cramped from holding your shield up, knowing that when the violence started you'd have room for maybe a 2-foot jabbing motion with your spear before the formations pressed together, and movement became impossible. It was knowing that if your line broke, if the man beside you fell or ran, the enemy would pour through the gap and you'd die not from heroic combat, but from being crushed or stabbed from angles you couldn't defend. Cinema shows us charges and dramatic melees. Reality was standing in compressed human walls, waiting to shove or be shoved. hoping your side held together better than theirs. Not exciting, not heroic. But this was the actual experience of most Viking Age warriors. Not dashing adventure, but claustrophobic, reeking, terrifying compression, where the greatest danger might be your own comrades crushing you when the lines collided. Chapter 7. The Spear Thrust. Monotonous, exhausting, deadly. Now let's discuss what actual combat looked like within the shield wall. And here we must dispel perhaps the grandest myth of all. The idea that medieval battle was about broad, sweeping weapon movements and dramatic exchanges. Once shield walls engaged, once the formations pressed together, combat became extraordinarily constrained and repetitive. Your world narrowed to the space immediately in front of you, perhaps 3 feet of width, where you could see enemy shields and the occasional glimpse of faces. Your weapon movements became short, economical, repetitive, not because you lacked skill or courage, but because physics and the press of bodies allowed nothing else. If you carried a spear, as most warriors did, your combat technique was this. Thrust the spear point over the top rim of your shield into the narrow space above enemy shields, aiming for faces, throats, shoulders. Withdraw the spear, thrust again, repeat, again, and again, and again. For minutes that felt like hours, until your arm burned and your grip weakened, and you wondered if you could possibly lift the spear one more time. Experimental archaeology has tested this reality with brutal clarity. Modern practitioners using replica weapons and period-accurate shield wall formations report significant arm fatigue within 5 to 10 minutes of active thrusting. The motion seems simple, it's just jabbing after all, not complicated sword work, but repetition kills you. Your shoulder burns, your forearm cramps, your grip on the spear shaft weakens as muscles exhaust, and you cannot stop, cannot rest, because stopping means the enemy has those seconds to thrust at you without response. Historical accounts support short periods of active combat. The Battle of Malden poem describes the battle in terms that suggest minutes of intense fighting, not hours. Byzantine military manuals describing how to fight northern European warriors, including Vikings serving in the Varangian Guard, note that they fight fiercely but tire quickly, suggesting their intensity couldn't be maintained for extended periods. The human body has limits, and those limits constrained medieval warfare in ways cinema casually ignores. The dark truth about this repetitive thrusting is what it did to human bodies over time. Most spear wounds weren't single mortal blows. They were accumulations, shallow puncture wounds, multiple strikes, gradual bleeding. Skeletal remains from battle sites show not single devastating injuries but numerous puncture marks, evidence of multiple spear thrusts finding flesh. A thrust to the shoulder that didn't hit bone but tore muscle. Another to the upper arm, one that glanced off a rib, another that punctured lung tissue. Individually, each wound might be survivable. Collectively, they killed through blood loss, exhaustion, and eventual shock. There's a saga account, I believe it's in Gisla Saga Sursonar, of a warrior receiving 17 spear wounds, none reaching vital organs, who nonetheless died from the accumulated trauma. That's not literary exaggeration when you understand the mechanics of shield wall combat. 17 thrusts over the course of a battle, each one penetrating flesh but missing heart, major arteries, lungs, entirely plausible, and entirely fatal through blood loss. What haunts me about this mode of combat is its unglamorous monotony combined with lethality. You weren't killed by a skilled opponent's clever strike. You were killed by repetition, by the 20th or 30th thrust that found flesh after the previous 19 had been blocked or deflected. Death came from exhaustion, your arm too tired to keep your shield up properly, a gap opening, a spear point slipping through. Or it came from bad luck, a thrust that happened to angle between ribs where others had glanced off bone. Or it came from mathematics. If your opponent thrust 30 times and you blocked 29, that 30th thrust killed you. There's no narrative satisfaction in that, no heroic arc, just brutal statistics playing out across compressed formations of exhausted men. The saga writers knew this, which is why they focused on exceptional moments rather than the boring reality of most deaths. But archaeology doesn't care about narrative satisfaction. The bones show repeated puncture wounds, shallow cuts, accumulating trauma, the reality of death by exhaustion and repetition. So when you imagine Viking Age combat, don't picture dramatic duels and clever weapon work. Picture a man standing in a compressed line, jabbing a spear over and over into the space above enemy shields, his arm burning with fatigue, his shoulder cramping, his grip weakening with each thrust, and across from him, an enemy doing the same thing, thrusting with mechanical repetition, hoping that this thrust, or the next, or the one after, would find flesh. Not exciting, not heroic, just monotonous, exhausting, and eventually deadly for someone. Usually whoever got tired first, or unlucky first, or whose formation broke first and turned monotonous thrusting into the chaos where men died quickly. We'll come to that chaos in later chapters. For now, understand that the most common form of Viking Age combat was repetitive spear thrusting, from behind shields until someone, anyone, broke. Boring history that killed efficiently, which is perhaps the most disturbing kind. Chapter 8. Why? Battles were usually shoving matches. We need to discuss something that sounds almost comical until you understand its brutal implications. Many Viking Age battles were essentially organised shoving matches, formations trying to physically push opponents backward until one side's cohesion broke. This wasn't a failure of warrior courage or skill, it was the logical result of shield wall tactics. When two shield walls met, when the front ranks locked shields and pressed together, individual weapon skill became largely irrelevant. What mattered was collective mass, determination, and the ability to maintain formation while pushing forward. Roman sources centuries earlier described this as characteristic of Germanic warfare. Battles where the whole struggle is decided by the strength of the shove. Byzantine manuals describing how to fight northern European warriors, including Vikings, note this same pattern. They form dense formations and push. The actual weapons become almost secondary to the physics of human bodies pressing against each other, trying to generate enough force to move the opposing mass backward. The mechanics of shield push are straightforward but exhausting. Your shield isn't just held passively in front of you, you're driving it forward with your body weight, using legs and back to generate force. The man behind you presses against your back, adding his weight to yours, helping you drive forward. The entire formation becomes a human wall, each rank pressing against the rank in front, collective force transferred through compressed bodies to the shields at the front where you're trying to drive the enemy back. It's exhausting. Your legs burn from pushing, your back strains from the pressure, your shield arm cramps from holding position while absorbing counter-pressure from the enemy doing the same thing. Historical accounts from later medieval battles using similar tactics describe formations collapsing not from wounds, but from exhaustion. Warriors literally too tired to keep pushing, formations falling back simply because legs gave out. This wasn't cowardice, it was human biomechanics reaching their limits. What makes this mode of combat particularly brutal is what happened to men caught in the middle of the shoving formations. More warriors died from crushing and trampling than from weapon wounds during the actual shoving phase. When two shield walls pressed together, the men in the front ranks experienced enormous compressive forces, their own side pushing them forward, the enemy pushing back. Ribs broke under the pressure. Breathing became difficult, then impossible if the crush was severe enough. There are accounts from medieval battles of men suffocating while standing upright, literally crushed to death between the press of bodies, dying without ever receiving a weapon wound. Archaeological evidence supports this. Skeletal remains from battle sites show crush injuries, broken ribs without associated weapon marks, trauma consistent with compressive forces rather than strikes. The mass grave at Visby, though from a later period, shows examples of this. Warriors whose injuries suggest they were crushed or trampled, bones broken by pressure rather than blades. When shield walls broke, and they always eventually broke, that's when the killing truly started. A line breaks when cohesion fails, when some part of the formation gives way under pressure. Maybe a warrior falls, from exhaustion or wounds, creating a gap. Maybe one section of the line is weaker, with fewer experienced men or worse equipment, and that section crumbles first. Once a gap opens, once the shield wall loses its unified structure, disaster follows for the breaking side. Enemies pour through the gap, attacking from angles the formation was never designed to handle. Men whose shields protected them from frontal attack are suddenly exposed on their sides or backs. The formation dissolves into chaos, and chaos favours aggression over defence. This is when men started dying en masse. Not from organised combat, but from frantic, desperate fighting, where shields couldn't properly protect and exhausted warriors faced fresh enemies pushing through breaches in the line. The psychological dimension of shoving combat is particularly interesting. You're not primarily fighting with weapons. You're pushing, straining against human resistance, feeling the enemy mass pressing back against you. It's intensely physical, but not in the way we imagine combat to be. You're closer to the enemy than weapons reach. You're pressed shield to shield, sometimes close enough to smell their breath. Some accounts describe warriors talking to each other during these shoving phases, exchanging insults or recognizing opponents they knew. The violence is less about killing and more about maintaining collective pressure until something breaks. But that makes the eventual breaking more terrifying. You go from this strange, constrained shoving, almost ritualized despite its intensity, to sudden chaos where men are dying in all directions. The transition from shoving match to massacre could happen in seconds, and the most dangerous moment might not be the shoving but the instant your own side started winning and surged forward. Men at the back, suddenly released from counter-pressure, surged forward, crushing those in front, trampling anyone who'd fallen, turning victory into a lethal stampede of your own comrades. Not heroic, not glorious. But this was reality. More men sometimes died from their own side's victory surge than from enemy weapons during the preceding standoff. Chapter 9. The rarity of sword combat, and why. It usually meant someone was dying. Let's return to swords, but now in the context of actual combat employment. Despite their prestige in saga literature and modern imagination, swords saw remarkably limited use in Viking Age battles. They were backup weapons, pulled when spears broke, or in the close quarters chaos after shield walls collapsed. There are good practical reasons for this. Swords were shorter than spears, meaning you had to get dangerously close to use them. Against shields, even the best swords delivered relatively ineffective cuts. Experimental archaeology shows wooden shields with leather facing can absorb multiple sword blows before failing. Against mail armour, rare though it was, swords delivered impact force but rarely penetrated rings, and swords tired users quickly. The repetitive cutting motion, the weight maintained at arm's length, exhausted fighters faster than spear thrusting. So swords stayed in sheaths or scabbards during the initial shield wall phase, held in reserve for situations where longer weapons were impractical. When swords did come out, it usually meant something had gone catastrophically wrong for someone. Shield walls had collapsed into melee chaos, or warriors were fighting in confined spaces, inside buildings, on ships, in narrow passages, where longer weapons couldn't be used effectively, or someone's spear had broken, leaving them desperately pulling backup weapons. Sword fighting in these contexts wasn't the elegant dueling of cinema. It was frantic, desperate hacking and cutting at close range, often against opponents whose own shields were damaged or lost, whose formation had broken, who were exhausted and disoriented from the collapse of their battle line. This is when men died quickly and horribly, from wounds that skeletal remains preserve in disturbing detail. Multiple cut marks on skulls, deep enough to penetrate bone. Defensive wounds on forearms and hands where warriors raised arms in futile attempts to protect heads. Severed limbs, blade marks on long bones showing clean cuts through muscle and bone that required tremendous force. The skeletal evidence for sword combat is particularly graphic. Unlike spear wounds, which tend to be punctures, sword wounds create distinctive cut marks in bone, usually V-shaped grooves where blades impacted skulls or long bones. We find these wounds in battle contexts, and they tell brutal stories. A skull from the Ridgeway Hill mass grave shows multiple sword cuts to the head, one deep enough to penetrate the cranial vault. The sequence is readable: first blow to the side of the head, probably while the victim was still standing. Second blow to the top of the skull after he fell or was brought down. These aren't combat wounds. There are no defensive injuries on the arms. These are execution wounds, delivered to someone already defeated. This pattern appears repeatedly in archaeological evidence. Sword wounds on victims who weren't actively defending themselves, suggesting many sword deaths happened after combat proper ended, during the killing phase when victors moved through the fallen and wounded. Ridgeway Hill deserves more attention because it illustrates this point perfectly. The mass grave contains 54 individuals, all young adult males, all showing evidence of violent death. The wound patterns are consistent. Many show beheading marks, clean cuts through neck vertebrae. Others show multiple cuts to heads and shoulders. Crucially, there are almost no defensive wounds, no cut marks on forearms, no injuries suggesting the victims were fighting back when killed. Archaeological interpretation suggests these were prisoners, executed after capture or defeat, systematically killed with swords and axes. Their heads were removed and in some cases placed incorrectly with bodies, suggesting deliberate mutilation or casual disregard for corpses. This is what sword use often looked like in Viking Age contexts. Not heroic dueling, but killing of defeated enemies, methodical violence against people who couldn't defend themselves, utility-cutting work that happened to involve human bodies. It's deeply sobering to think about swords in this context. In saga literature, swords have names, grammar, Tyrfinger, Skofnung, and personalities. Their heirlooms passed through generations, objects of prestige and power, and yes, they were valuable, expensive, status symbols. But their primary combat use was often not heroic dueling, but desperate close quarters fighting after formations collapsed, or systematic killing of the defeated, or execution work after battles ended. When we find sword-cut skulls in mass graves, we're not finding evidence of heroic combat. We're finding evidence of what happened when heroic combat ended and ugly utility violence began. The sword, the weapon popular culture treats as the ultimate symbol of warrior honour, was often the tool of defeat and execution, pulled when someone's protection had failed and their chances of survival had dropped to essentially zero. Not the weapon of heroes, or not only that, but also the weapon of butchers, doing necessary but unglamorous work that followed after the boring, exhausting shield wall combat had determined who won and who was about to die badly. Chapter 10. Berserkers. Mushroom theory versus brutal reality. We should address berserkers because no discussion of Viking warfare is complete without examining these legendary warriors who supposedly entered trance-like fury, fought without armour, felt no pain, and performed superhuman feats of violence. Popular theories abound. They consumed psychoactive mushrooms, usually Amanita muscaria, or they had psychological conditions causing dissociative states, or they practiced shamanic rituals inducing altered consciousness. These theories sound plausible enough that they appear in documentaries and popular histories as established fact. The problem is there's essentially no archaeological or reliable historical evidence for any of them. No graves contain mushroom residues. No contemporary accounts describe drug use. The entire berserker mushroom theory appears to be a modern invention, first proposed in the 1960s, with no basis in Viking Age sources. So what were berserkers actually? The answer, as so often happens when we strip away romanticism, is probably more economic and social than mystical. Let's examine what the sagas actually say about berserkers, reading carefully rather than romantically. Yes, they describe men who fought with unusual ferocity, who sometimes fought without mail armour, who seemed to disregard personal safety. But they also describe berserkers in notably unflattering terms. They're often young men without property, landless sons of good families who had no inheritance coming. They're frequently described as troublemakers, men who challenged others to duels, holmgang, who demanded tribute, who caused problems for communities. There are saga accounts of berserkers being outlawed, killed by heroes, portrayed as antagonists rather than admirable warriors. The fury attributed to them might not have been drug-induced trance, but something much simpler and darker. The recklessness of men with nothing to lose, no future prospects, fighting with desperation because desperate fighting was their only path to wealth and status. The dark reveal here is about economics and social structure, not mysticism. Viking Age. Scandinavia practiced primogeniture in many regions. The oldest son inherited land. Younger sons got little or nothing. If you were a younger son of a family with limited property, your options were limited. Become a dependent on your brother's farm, try to buy or marry into land elsewhere, enter the church, less common in pagan periods, or pursue warfare and raiding in hopes of acquiring wealth and status through violence. Berserker might have been less a mystical state and more a social category. Young men with good family connections but no property, choosing risky military careers because they had no better options. Their fury was the fury of desperation, fighting recklessly because cautious fighting gets you nothing when you're trying to build a reputation and acquire wealth quickly before age or injury ends your fighting years. There's a particularly revealing saga account in Egil's saga Skalla Grimsonar describing berserkers in notably non-mystical terms. The saga describes them as men of good family who had fallen on hard times, and notes that they made their living by challenging others to duels and taking their property. This isn't shamanic trance, this is protection racket violence. These men travelled, challenged wealthy farmers or merchants to duels, which were legally sanctioned in this period, and either killed their opponents and took their property or extracted payment to go away. The saga treats them as problems to be solved, not as mystical warriors to be admired. When the hero Egil encounters berserkers, he defeats them through skill and cunning, and the saga's audience is expected to cheer their deaths. These are antagonists, not heroes, men whose desperation made them dangerous and antisocial, preying on communities rather than defending them. So the next time you encounter berserker theories involving mushrooms and trance states, consider the simpler, more historically supportable explanation. These were probably young men in impossible social positions, landless, but from families with warrior traditions, choosing risky violence as a survival strategy because they had no path to normal adult life. Their lack of armour wasn't mystical confidence, it was poverty, inability to afford mail that cost more than a farm. Their ferocity wasn't drug-induced, it was the recklessness of men who had to win fights quickly and dramatically to build reputations, because a long, cautious career required land and resources they didn't have. Their early deaths, which sagas mentioned frequently, weren't glorious sacrifices. They were the predictable outcome of desperate, reckless fighting by poorly protected men against opponents who could afford better equipment. Not romantic, not mystical, just brutal economic reality producing brief violent careers for young men with no better options. The saga writers knew this, which is why they often portray berserkers unsympathetically. We've romanticised what they understood was primarily tragic, desperation driving young men to short, brutal lives because social structure gave them no alternative. Chapter 11. What battle wounds actually looked like. Let's discuss what wounds actually were, stripping away cinematic fantasy. In films, warriors receive clean strikes, a sword through the heart, instant death, the body collapsing gracefully. Or they fight through multiple wounds without apparent effect until dramatically falling at a narratively appropriate moment. Reality, preserved in skeletal remains and described in medical texts from the period and shortly after, was far less tidy. Most wounds weren't instantly fatal. Most wounds weren't even to the torso where vital organs could be struck. Archaeological analysis of battle trauma shows consistent patterns. The majority of wounds were defensive injuries, evidence of warriors desperately trying to protect themselves. Cut marks on forearm bones where men raised arms to shield heads from descending blades. Fractured hand bones from grabbing at weapons. Wounds to the left side of the body, the shield side, where protection failed or wasn't adequate. This is what real combat wounds looked like, evidence of fear and desperate defence, not heroic offence. The specific injury patterns tell stories that trauma archaeologists can read like text. Defensive wounds on forearms appear as cut marks on the radius and ulnar bones, usually on the outer, posterior surface, where the arm was raised palm inward to protect the face. These aren't combat strikes, these are last-ditch protection reflexes. We find these wounds on skeletons from battle sites with disturbing frequency, and they tell us that warriors saw death coming and raised their arms in futile attempts to stop blades. Sometimes we find multiple defensive wounds on the same skeleton, several cuts to one forearm or cuts to both arms, suggesting prolonged defence or multiple attackers. There are graves showing healed defensive wounds alongside fresh fatal wounds, warriors who survived one battle with arm injuries only to die in another. These patterns don't appear in saga accounts, which focus on offensive action and killing blows, but they dominate the archaeological record. Most warriors died defending themselves, not heroically attacking. The left side bias in skeletal trauma is particularly revealing. When archaeologists examine weapon trauma across multiple sites and time periods, wounds to the left side of the skull, left shoulder, and left arm appear more frequently than right side wounds. This makes perfect sense when you understand shield wall combat. Your shield protected your left side and centre, but it had to move to block attacks, creating momentary exposures. Your right side was theoretically protected by your neighbour's shield, but gaps in formation or shield wall collapse left that side exposed. The pattern we see is warriors getting hit where shields didn't protect, the left side where your own shield moved or was struck aside, or occasionally the right when formation failed. These aren't random injuries. They're the predictable result of specific combat conditions, the mathematical consequence of overlapping shields that had to be mobile to be effective, leaving gaps that enemy weapons exploited. Facial trauma appears with disturbing frequency in battle contexts. Skulls show nasal bone fractures, crushed eye sockets, broken teeth, fractured cheekbones. Some of this trauma comes from shield bosses, as we discussed earlier, those distinctive circular impact patterns. But much comes from pommel strikes, using the heavy pommel, the weight at the end of a sword handle, as a close-quarters striking tool, or from being struck by spear shafts, or from falling face first after being wounded and hitting frozen ground or rocks. The face was vulnerable in ways torso and limbs weren't, and head wounds were common enough that some helmets, the rare ones that existed, had nasal guards extending down to protect the face. But most warriors had no helmets, leaving faces exposed to any weapon that got past shields. There's archaeological evidence of warriors surviving horrific facial trauma, skulls showing healed fractures, bone remodeling where injuries mended over months, which tells us that even devastating face wounds weren't immediately fatal. You could survive having your jaw broken, your nose crushed, your cheekbone caved in, and live for years or decades after, though your quality of life and your appearance would be permanently altered. It's sobering to think about what battle wounds actually meant for survivors. Not dramatic scars that looked impressive, though scars certainly resulted, but missing fingers from defensive wounds that severed tendons and bones, permanent arm disabilities from cuts that damaged muscles and nerves, facial disfigurement from broken bones that healed incorrectly or not at all, chronic pain from bone fractures that set poorly. These weren't heroic marks of combat, these were permanent disabilities that affected daily life for decades. A shepherd who survived battle with defensive wounds to his hand might never grip a staff properly again. A farmer with a fractured arm that healed poorly might struggle with harvest work. The saga accounts rarely mention these consequences because they focus on heroes whose wounds either killed them gloriously or healed completely. But archaeology shows us the unheroic majority, men who survived battles, but carried the physical consequences for the rest of their shortened lives, wounds that weren't immediately fatal but were permanently debilitating, marking them as survivors of violence that popular culture treats as glorious, but that their bodies remembered as trauma. Chapter 12. Skeletal evidence. Hacked skulls and severed limbs. Now we must discuss what bones preserve, because skeletal remains are our most direct evidence of how weapons were actually used on human bodies. When archaeologists excavate battle sites or warrior burials showing violent trauma, they find weapon marks on bones, and these marks are remarkably informative. Different weapons create distinctive trauma patterns. Swords create V-shaped cuts, clean grooves where sharp edges impacted bone with enough force to slice through. Axes create deeper V-shaped cuts or sometimes catastrophic fractures from the combination of blade edge and mass behind the blow. Spears create puncture wounds, circular or oval holes where points penetrated bone. Blunt weapons create fracture patterns without cutting, crushed skulls, broken bones showing impact force rather than edge trauma. Each weapon type leaves its signature in bone, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct not just that violence occurred, but specifically what kinds of weapons were used, and how. The mass grave at Visby in Gotland is perhaps the most famous example of this kind of analysis. The 1361 battle left over 200 dead, many still wearing armour, buried hastily in mass graves that preserved both armour and bones. Modern archaeological analysis of these remains has produced detailed wound catalogues showing exactly what happened to medieval warriors in close combat. Many skulls show weapon trauma, even though the warriors wore mail coifs, mail head protection. Swords and axes struck with enough force to deform mail and cut through to bone underneath. Some skulls show multiple weapon marks, 3, 4, 5 distinct cuts to the same skull, suggesting frenzied or methodical strikes after the warrior fell. The patterns indicate that much of the killing happened after warriors were down. Initial wounds disabled or stunned them, then multiple finishing blows ensured death. Not quick, not clean, but systematic slaughter of defeated men who were probably still conscious when the killing strikes fell. Ridgeway Hill in England provides another disturbing window into Viking Age violence. The mass grave contains 54 individuals, all young adult males, late teens to mid-20s, all showing evidence of violent death. Many were beheaded, clean cuts through neck vertebrae, heads removed and in some cases placed incorrectly with bodies or missing entirely. Others show multiple cuts to heads and shoulders. One individual has 5 separate blade marks on his skull, another shows cuts to neck vertebrae from multiple angles, suggesting the head was removed methodically rather than with a single stroke. Crucially, as mentioned earlier, there are minimal defensive wounds. These men weren't killed in combat, they were executed after capture or defeat. The archaeological interpretation, combined with radiocarbon dating suggesting Viking Age origin, is that these were likely Vikings themselves, perhaps raiders captured by Anglo-Saxon defenders, or survivors of a defeated force who were systematically killed. What makes skeletal evidence particularly powerful is what it reveals about post-combat violence. Many remains from battle contexts show what archaeologists call overkill, more weapon trauma than necessary to cause death, multiple strikes to already fatal wounds, systematic mutilation. A warrior at Visby received 12 weapon strikes to the head, any one of which might have been fatal. Why 12? Either frenzied violence in the moment, or methodical killing to ensure death, or possibly multiple fighters striking the same fallen enemy. We find beheaded bodies where the beheading required multiple attempts, neck vertebrae showing several partial cuts before the final severing cut, evidence that removing heads wasn't easy and often took multiple strikes with heavy blades. We find evidence of deliberate mutilation, limbs severed post-mortem, bones showing cuts that couldn't have occurred during combat but must have been inflicted on corpses. It's profoundly disturbing to look at photographs of these skeletal remains, to see the cut marks and fractures and penetrations, and remember these were living people. Young men mostly. The skeletal analysis shows that most warriors were in their late teens through early 30s, with many concentrated in the 1825 age range. They had names, families, lives that mattered to someone, and they died violently, often horribly, their bones preserving evidence of trauma that cinema sanitizes and saga literature romanticizes. The skull split by an axe blow wasn't a heroic death. It was a young man feeling the impact, the blinding pain, possibly remaining conscious for seconds or minutes while his brain hemorrhaged. The multiple cuts to a neck showing laboured beheading weren't quick execution. They were someone dying while blades sawed through their throat, potentially aware for multiple strokes. These bones don't lie, and what they tell us about Viking Age combat is that most deaths were ugly, prolonged, often occurred after defeat when men couldn't properly resist, and involved violence beyond what was necessary to kill. Not because Vikings were uniquely brutal. Similar patterns appear in battle sites across cultures and periods, but because violence, once unleashed, follows its own logic that has little to do with honour or necessity, and everything to do with fear, rage, and the aftermath of survival. Chapter 13. Surviving a wound. Infection. Gangrene. Slow death. Let us now turn to what happened after the battle, to those who survived the initial violence but carried wounds away with them. This is where the real horror begins, because for every warrior who died quickly from a spear through the heart or skull split by an axe, many more died slowly in the days and weeks following from wounds that didn't seem immediately fatal. We must understand, there were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no understanding of germ theory or infection mechanisms. A wound was packed with whatever seemed helpful, herbs, honey, moss, cloth, and then you waited to see if it would heal or kill you. Medical knowledge was limited to practical experience. Some wounds healed, others festered, and the reasons remained mysterious. All they could do was observe symptoms and try remedies that sometimes worked and often didn't. The timeline of infection follows a predictable course that medieval people recognized even if they didn't understand the mechanisms. In the first day or two after wounding, pain and bleeding dominated. If the wound was severe enough to cause death from blood loss, it usually happened within hours. But many wounds, shallow cuts, punctures that missed major vessels, cuts to extremities, bled for a while, and then clotted. This was the dangerous period, the time when you thought you might survive. Over the next few days, infection began if bacteria had been introduced into the wound, which was almost certain given the conditions. Redness appeared around wound edges, swelling, heat to touch. The wound began to suppurate, producing pus that medieval medicine actually considered healthy, the body purging the wound. But if the infection was serious, symptoms progressed. Fever, spreading redness, what we now know as cellulitis, swollen lymph nodes. If untreated, and Viking Age medicine had no effective treatments for serious bacterial infections, sepsis developed. High fever, confusion, rapid heartbeat, organ failure, death. The saga descriptions of wound fever match perfectly with what we now understand as sepsis symptoms. They describe warriors burning with fever, thrashing deliriously, sometimes lasting days before dying. They describe wounds turning black or developing terrible smells, likely gangrene, the death of tissue from infection or inadequate blood supply. Wet gangrene produces putrid, sweet-rotten smells and blackened, oozing tissue. Dry gangrene turns extremities black and mummified. Both were likely death sentences in the Viking Age. Once infection spread through the bloodstream, once organ systems began failing from septic shock, nothing in their medical repertoire could save the patient. And this happened to warriors who'd survived the battle itself, who'd made it home or to wherever their army was camped, who thought they might live only to spend their final days in fever delirium, dying slowly while their families or comrades watched helplessly. There's a famous account in Fostbrodra saga describing the warrior Thormod's death that captures this reality perfectly. Thormod survives the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 with an arrow wound to his chest. He extracts the arrow himself, examining the blood on the arrowhead and remarking that, "The king has fed us well, there is still fat around my heart," meaning the blood is bright red and fatty, indicating the arrow reached his heart region. This is presented as heroic stoicism, Thormod joking about his fatal wound. He dies shortly afterward, presumably from internal bleeding or the trauma of removing an arrow that had penetrated deep into his torso. The saga treats this as a good death, conscious, in control, dying from an honest battle wound. But consider the alternative. If Thormod had received a less dramatic wound, one that seemed survivable, he might have lingered for days with infections spreading through his chest cavity, drowning in fever and delirium, dying slowly from sepsis rather than quickly from acute trauma. The heroic deaths were often the quick ones. The common deaths were the slow infections that saga writers didn't dwell on, because there's nothing heroic about dying delirious from wound fever. Legal codes from the Viking Age and shortly after preserved compensation schemes for wounds that recognised infection risks. Laws specified different compensation levels for different wound types, with provisions for wounds turning fatal after initially seeming survivable. This only makes sense in a context where everyone understood that wounds killed in delayed fashion, that initial survival didn't guarantee long-term survival, that infection could turn a seemingly minor cut into a death sentence. The legal system had to account for the time lag between wounding and death, establishing that the person who caused the wound was responsible even if death came days or weeks later. This tells us that delayed death from wounds was common enough to require systematic legal accommodation. For every warrior who died gloriously in battle, how many died in glorious weeks later, feverish and delirious, their wounds festering despite all attempts at treatment? The numbers aren't preserved in saga literature, which focused on immediate dramatic deaths, but the legal codes suggest it was common enough to be unremarkable. Just another way violence in the Viking Age killed people, slower and more miserably than the quick deaths that made it into heroic poetry. Chapter 14. The Sounds and Smells of Medieval Combat. Cinema gives us orchestral scores and clean visuals. The clash of weapons sounds crisp and metallic. Warriors breathe heavily, but don't scream. Blood is visible, but doesn't smell. The reality of medieval combat assaulted all the senses in ways that film cannot and will not replicate, because authentic sensory experience would make viewing intolerable. Let us discuss what it actually sounded like, what it smelled like, what the complete sensory environment of Viking Age battle was. Because these sensory elements weren't incidental to the experience, they were part of the psychological assault, part of what made combat traumatic beyond the physical violence. Understanding the sounds and smells helps us understand why warriors broke, why psychological limits often determined battles more than physical casualties. The sounds were, by all accounts, overwhelming and horrible. Start with the human sounds. Men screaming, not battle cries, but actual screams of pain and terror. the sound of someone taking a spear through the abdomen, the involuntary vocalization as their diaphragm spasms, the sounds of men begging, pleading in moments when combat paused or they lay wounded on the field, warriors crying, actual weeping from fear or pain or the sight of friends dying. Historical accounts from various medieval battles mention the sound of men calling for their mothers, for gods, for help that wouldn't come. Then add the impacts. Wood on wood as shields crash together, that peculiar hollow thock sound. Metal on wood as weapons struck shields, a different tone, sharper. Metal on metal when weapons met. Not the ringing sound cinema uses, which is enhanced and dramatised, but sharper, briefer, often unpleasant. And the breaking sounds, shields splintering, bones cracking, which have distinctive sounds warriors would learn to recognise. The smells were, if anything, worse than the sounds. Start with the baseline. Medieval people rarely bathed, wore clothes that weren't frequently washed, had different hygiene standards than we do. A group of unwashed warriors in wool clothing already produce significant body odour. Add stress and fear. Humans produce distinct odours when terrified. An adrenal response causes sweating with a particularly sharp, acrid smell. Now add voided bowels and bladders. We discussed earlier that men lost control of bodily functions from fear, and in a compressed shield wall with nowhere to move, you stood in close proximity to this. The smell would have been overwhelming. Human waste, fear sweat, regular body odour, all mixing in the close quarters of a shield wall where men stood pressed together, breathing each other's exhalations. This isn't speculation. Multiple historical accounts from medieval warfare mention the stench of battle formations, stated matter-of-factly as part of the experience. Blood has a distinctive smell, metallic, slightly sweet, unmistakable if you've ever smelled significant quantities of it. In close combat, blood sprayed from wounds soaking into wool clothing where it would smell particularly strongly. Butchers and hunters know this smell, the warm iron tang of fresh blood. Now imagine that smell mixed with all the others, and add this, stomach wound smell. When intestines are perforated, when stomach contents spill into the abdominal cavity, or out through wounds, they produce foul odours of partially digested food and digestive acids. Warriors, receiving abdominal wounds would release these smells, and in the compressed environment of shield wall combat, those around them would smell it. Accounts from various medieval and early modern battles mention warriors vomiting from the stench before combat even began, their stomachs turning from the combination of fear and smell. Once fighting started, once blood was in the air and men were dying from wounds that released bodily contents, the smell became overwhelming enough that even hardened warriors struggled with nausea. There's an account, I believe in Heimskringla, describing the Battle of Stiklestad, mentioning warriors turning away to be sick and needing to be shamed back into line by commanders. This makes perfect sense when you understand the sensory environment. You're already terrified, adrenaline making your stomach churn. The man beside you has soiled himself from fear. Someone in front has taken a stomach wound, and the smell of intestinal contents is mixing with blood smell and fear sweat. Your own body is rebelling, nausea rising, and your only options are to vomit while standing in line or try to suppress it. Either way remaining in the formation because leaving means death or dishonour or both. So when we talk about the courage required for Viking Age warfare, we need to include sensory courage, the ability to stand in an environment that assaulted every sense, that made your body want to flee, that was so viscerally repulsive that vomiting was common. Cinema never shows this because it can't. You can't replicate smell or truly convey sound through speakers. But these sensory elements were as much part of the experience as the violence, perhaps more psychologically damaging than the violence, because they lasted longer and affected everyone, not just those directly wounded. The sounds of friends dying, the smell of fear and blood and waste, these stayed with survivors, part of the trauma that saga literature rarely addresses, but that made Viking Age combat and assault on every sense simultaneously. Chapter 15. Shield arm injuries, the most common wound. Let's focus on a specific wound pattern that dominates the archaeological record. Injuries to the left arm and shoulder, the shield-bearing side. When archaeologists examine skeletal remains from battle contexts across multiple sites and periods, They find weapon trauma concentrated on the left side at roughly 3 times the frequency of right side injuries. This isn't random chance. It's the predictable consequence of shield wall combat mechanics. Your shield covered your left side, but shields had to move to block attacks, creating momentary exposures. And shields weren't complete protection. They were wooden boards, absorbent of impacts but ultimately destructible. Enemy warriors deliberately targeted shield arms, because disabling that arm meant disabling the warrior's primary protection, leaving them vulnerable to killing strikes. Understanding shield arm injuries means understanding not just anatomy but tactics, how warriors fought, what they targeted, how wounds accumulated strategically rather than randomly. The basic vulnerability is geometric. A shield has to be mobile to be effective. You can't simply hold it static in one position and expect to block attacks from varying angles. So the shield moved, up to block high strikes, down to block low, angled to deflect rather than absorb impacts. Each movement created exposure gaps. Your shoulder lifted when you raised the shield. Your forearm extended when you reached to block a wide attack. The upper arm was exposed when the shield dropped to block low. Experienced warriors knew these gaps and exploited them. Archaeological evidence suggests deliberate targeting. We find specific wound patterns on shield arm shoulders, concentrated areas of trauma that suggest attackers aimed for predictable exposure points. A spear thrust at the moment a shield rose to block high would catch the shoulder. A sword cut timed as a shield moved laterally would catch the forearm. These weren't lucky strikes. They were tactical targeting of vulnerable moments. What makes shield arm injuries particularly dark is the tactical calculation behind them. Warriors deliberately wounded shield arms not to kill, but to disable protection, making subsequent killing strikes easier. Cutting the muscles or tendons in a shield arm meant the warrior could no longer effectively hold or maneuver the shield, leaving them exposed. There's archaeological evidence for this, skeletal remains showing healed shield arm injuries alongside later fatal wounds, suggesting warriors survived battles where their shield arm was disabled, only to die in later battles where they couldn't properly defend themselves. Legal codes recognise shield arm wounds as serious, assigning significant compensation values, but notably less than sword arm wounds, the reasoning being that a man with a disabled shield arm could still farm and work, while a disabled sword arm was more limiting. This pragmatic legal calculation tells us shield arm injuries were common enough to require standardised compensation, expected outcomes of warfare rather than unusual occurrences. The specific injuries we find are brutal in their variety. Cut marks on the humerus, upper arm bone, where blades sliced through muscle and struck bone. Fractured radius and ulnar, forearm bones, from blocking strikes or from impacts that broke arms even without cutting through. Shoulder blade fractures from blunt force trauma, shield bosses or pommel strikes to shoulders, and healed fractures, evidence of warriors who survived shield arm injuries and lived for years or decades after. The healing patterns tell us these fractures often set poorly, bones that healed at angles creating permanent disabilities. A warrior whose left arm healed with the humerus shortened or angled differently than before would have permanently reduced range of motion. His ability to raise and maneuver a shield would be compromised for life. He might return to farming, might even return to warfare, but his effectiveness would be reduced, his vulnerability increased. These weren't glorious scars. They were permanent disabilities marking survivors of battles they were lucky to walk away from. So the next time popular culture shows warriors losing shields and continuing to fight effectively with weapons alone, remember, losing shield function, whether the shield itself was destroyed or the arm that held it was disabled, was often a death sentence. The archaeological record shows us warriors who took shield arm wounds and survived, but it also shows us that many who lost shield function died shortly after, from wounds to newly exposed body areas. The shield arm wasn't secondary to the weapon arm. In many ways it was more important, the primary survival tool in combat where offence mattered less than defence. And the most common wound pattern we find, left side trauma, shield arm injuries, tells us that warriors understood this and targeted it deliberately. Disable the defence, then kill the exposed warrior. Simple tactics, brutal implementation, and a reminder that Viking Age combat was less about heroic weapon skill and more about systematic exploitation of predictable vulnerabilities. The shield arm was the most predictable vulnerability, and the skeletal record shows us how often it was targeted, how often those targeting strikes succeeded, and how those survivable but debilitating wounds marked warriors for the rest of their foreshortened lives. Chapter 16. The Myth of Training. Most learned by dying. We have modern expectations about warrior preparation, shaped by images of medieval knights training from childhood, martial arts schools with systematic curricula, military boot camps that transform civilians into soldiers through months of structured instruction. These expectations colour how we imagine Viking Age warriors. Surely they trained, surely they practiced, surely there were systems for teaching combat skills before men faced actual battle. The archaeological and historical evidence suggests something far less reassuring. There's essentially no evidence for systematic training schools, formal instruction programs, or organised preparation for warfare in Viking Age Scandinavia. Most men who fought were farmers who picked up weapons during raiding season or when communities faced threats. Their training was whatever informal practice they managed, sparring with neighbours, learning from fathers or brothers, and actual combat, where the learning curve was steep and graduation requirements were simply surviving. The distinction in saga literature is revealing. Sagas distinguish between battle-tested warriors and untried men, but this designation comes from survival, not training. A battle-tested warrior was someone who'd survived previous combat. That's the qualification, not skill developed through training, not techniques learned from masters, but simple survival. The untried warrior was someone facing their first battle, regardless of whether they'd practiced with weapons for years or picked up a spear for the first time that morning. This tells us that actual combat experience was what mattered, and that experience couldn't be replicated through training. You learned warfare by surviving it, and if you didn't survive, well, you never became battle-tested. It's a brutal selection process. Those who survived tended to be somewhat skilled, somewhat lucky, or both. Those who died in their first battle simply disappeared from the warrior population, their lack of skill or bad luck removing them from the gene pool and the saga record simultaneously. The dark truth here is about learning curves and mortality. First battles had massive casualties among inexperienced fighters. We can infer this from various sources: historical accounts that distinguish between veteran and green troops, legal codes that specify different compensations for killing experienced versus inexperienced warriors, and the brutal mathematics of selection. If you're an inexperienced fighter facing experienced opponents, you're at severe disadvantage. You don't know how to read combat flow, when to advance or hold, how to coordinate with the men beside you. You haven't learned to manage fear effectively, to maintain shield discipline when terror screams at you to run. You haven't internalized the small survival skills that come from experience, keeping weight on your back foot so you can retreat quickly, watching peripheral vision for incoming strikes, listening for the sounds that indicate formation breaking. All these things separate survivors from casualties, and inexperienced warriors hadn't learned them yet. Many died before they could. There's a passage in Brennunjal's saga describing a battle where the young men fell in great numbers while the older warriors survived. The saga doesn't explain this, treating it as unremarkable. Of course, the young men died. But think about what this means. Age and experience mattered more than youth and physical vigour. The older warriors survived not because they were stronger or faster, they likely weren't, but because they'd survived previous battles and learned from them. They knew when to hold shields up despite arm fatigue, knew not to break formation for tempting targets, knew the sounds and rhythms of combat that warned of danger. The young men, regardless of how fit or brave, lacked this learning and died in great numbers. That's our evidence for training's absence. If systematic training existed, if young warriors arrived at battles well prepared, we wouldn't see such dramatic mortality differences based on experience. The fact that first battles killed disproportionately suggests most warriors arrived unprepared, learning on the job, graduating through survival, or dying before graduation. So when we picture Viking Age armies, we shouldn't imagine trained soldiers with systematic preparation. We should picture farmers who'd maybe practiced with weapons occasionally, who knew the basic motions but hadn't internalized them under stress, who faced their first battle with whatever folk wisdom they'd absorbed about warfare, but no real preparation for its psychological and physical realities. Some survived, through skill, luck, good equipment, strong formation discipline, and became the experienced warriors that saga literature celebrates. Many didn't survive, dying in their first battle from mistakes that experience might have prevented, lack of skills that training might have provided. Their deaths weren't recorded in heroic poetry because there's nothing heroic about dying from inexperience, about making obvious mistakes, about breaking when you should hold because no one taught you how to master fear. These deaths were just statistical noise, the expected casualties of untrained conscripts facing violence they weren't prepared for. Not glorious, not memorable, just young men learning by dying, their education ending with their first and final lesson in what warfare actually meant. The survivors learned from watching them fall. That was the training program. Observe friends dying, internalize what killed them, try not to make the same mistakes. Brutal pedagogy, but apparently the only pedagogy most Viking Age warriors received. Chapter 17. Weapon weight and fatigue. Battles lasted minutes, not hours. Hollywood gives us battles lasting hours. Warriors swinging weapons tirelessly through extended combat scenes. Heroes fighting from dawn to dusk without apparent exhaustion. This is physical impossibility dressed as drama. Experimental archaeology, modern researchers using period-accurate weapons and armour, attempting to replicate Viking Age combat conditions, has revealed brutal limitations that cinema ignores. Humans exhaust quickly when swinging weapons, and battles probably lasted minutes of active combat, not hours. The confusion comes from conflating battle, which could indeed last hours, with fighting, which was brief and intense. Most of battle time was standoff, psychological warfare, positioning, waiting. The actual weapon-swinging violence was compressed into short periods, because human physiology has limits. Medieval warriors couldn't exceed through courage or determination alone. The physics are straightforward. Swinging a weapon requires full body movement generating force through legs, hips, shoulders, and arms. Even relatively light weapons, a sword at 2-3 pounds, an axe at similar weight, become exhausting when swung repeatedly at combat speed. Modern experimental archaeologists and martial artists using replica Viking Age weapons consistently report the same findings. Significant arm fatigue within 5 to 10 minutes of active sparring or combat simulation. Your shoulders burn, your grip weakens, your form deteriorates as tired muscles can no longer maintain proper technique. And this is with modern participants who are often quite fit, well-fed, training under controlled conditions. Medieval warriors were probably hardier in some ways, more accustomed to physical labour, tougher from daily hardship, but they also faced combat while frightened, adrenaline-charged, potentially already exhausted from marching or waiting in formation, wearing whatever armour they possessed, which tires you even when you're not fighting, in weather that might be cold or hot or wet. Historical accounts, when read carefully, actually support short active combat periods, rather than extended fighting. The Battle of Malden poem, our best contemporary-ish account of Viking Age combat, describes the battle in ways that suggest minutes of intense fighting between periods of standoff. The warriors exchange missile weapons first, spears thrown, arrows shot, then the shield walls meet, then relatively brief descriptions of the actual melee before the Anglo-Saxon force breaks. The sense is of compression, of violence happening quickly once engaged. Byzantine military manuals describing how to fight northern European warriors, including Scandinavians serving in the Varangian Guard, specifically note that they fight with great ferocity but tire quickly and recommend defensive tactics that exhaust them before counterattacking. This only makes sense if active combat was measured in minutes, not hours. Fight defensively, let them exhaust themselves swinging weapons at your shields, then attack when they're too tired to maintain intensity. The dark reality is that battles often ended not because one side defeated the other through superior combat skill, but because one or both sides reached physical exhaustion. Your arms won't lift shields anymore. Your legs tremble from the sustained tension of maintaining stance. Your grip on weapons has weakened to the point where strikes lack force, and exhaustion brings its own danger. Tired warriors make mistakes, let shields drop, miss blocks they would normally make, stumble when they should hold ground. The side that retained marginally more energy often won simply by being able to continue fighting when opponents couldn't, not through superior skill but superior stamina. And stamina correlated with things like nutrition, age, previous health, factors largely outside individual control. A well-fed warrior from a prosperous farm lasted longer than a half-starved warrior from marginal land. Age mattered. Young men had physical vigour but less experience managing energy. Older warriors knew how to pace themselves but had less raw endurance. The intersection of age and experience created an optimal range, probably late 20s to mid-30s, where warriors had both physical capacity and learned energy management. It's sobering to think about warfare in these terms, as fundamentally limited by human physiology rather than courage or skill. The reason battles were usually short periods of violence was because humans physically couldn't maintain combat intensity longer. You couldn't will yourself past exhaustion. You couldn't be brave enough to keep swinging weapons when muscles failed. The body has hard limits, and those limits constrained medieval warfare as much as tactics or equipment. So when we imagine Viking Age battles, we should picture not hours of continuous fighting, but minutes of exhausting violence between periods of recovery, standoff, manoeuvring. The actual weapon swinging lasted until bodies gave out, which happened quickly, perhaps 5 to 15 minutes of genuine intensity before exhaustion forced a pause. And if your side exhausted first, if your warriors couldn't lift shields anymore while enemies still had strength, that's often when battles were decided, not through heroic combat, but through fatigue, through the unglamorous reality that human bodies have limits medieval warriors couldn't transcend. The boring truth. Most battles were probably decided by who was less tired when exhaustion hit everyone, which depended on factors like nutrition and rest as much as courage. Not exciting, not heroic, but apparently true. Chapter 18. The Psychology of Standing in Line. While friends die. Let us discuss the psychological dimension of shield wall combat, because this is where courage truly mattered, not in the fighting itself, which was largely mechanical and instinctive once begun, but in the waiting and witnessing that preceded and surrounded violence. Imagine, you're standing in formation, shield locked with neighbours' shields, waiting for combat to begin. The warrior to your right, maybe a friend, maybe your brother, someone you've known your entire life, takes a spear thrust to the face. You hear the impact, hear his scream or gurgle or whatever sound he makes, feel his body slam against yours as he falls, and you must step over him or step on him, close the gap his falling created, maintain formation while his blood soaks into the ground beneath your feet and probably onto your boots and trousers. The battle continues. Another man falls, then another, and you must stand there, watching this, unable to flee, unable to help the wounded, simply maintaining position while the reality of mortality plays out in your peripheral vision. The psychological challenge isn't abstract, it's visceral and immediate. You can see death happening. Unlike modern warfare where enemies are often distant, where death comes from unseen bullets or distant artillery, shield wall combat put you face to face with both the enemy and your own casualties. You watched men die. You saw the exact moment life left them, saw the expressions change from pain or fear to nothing, and you knew with absolute certainty that you might be next. The randomness of it, a spear thrust that caught your neighbour instead of you, not because you were more skilled but because of 6 inches of positioning, would have been maddening. There's no control. You can't ensure survival through skill alone. You must stand and wait for violence that might kill you randomly, might bypass you randomly, with no way to influence the outcome beyond maintaining shield discipline and hoping. Historical accounts and later medieval sources describe the psychological breaking point in specific terms. Battles ended when one side lost heart, when morale broke before the formation did. Casualty rates at which formations broke vary by account, but consistently suggest relatively low percentages, often 10 to 15% casualties before mass desertions began. This seems counterintuitive until you understand the psychology. You're watching every 10th man around you die, watching the random selection process, knowing that if this continues, your chances of being next increase with each passing minute. At some point, the calculation flips. Better to risk death fleeing than certainty of eventual death standing. The routing often happened suddenly. A few men at the edges beginning to step back, then more following, then the entire formation collapsing as psychological contagion spread faster than officers could stop it. Not because warriors were cowardly, but because human psychology has limits, and watching friends die while waiting your turn eventually breaks even brave men. The Malden poem captures this perfectly in describing the aftermath of the English leader's death. Some warriors stand and die with their lord, Others flee, and the poem names both groups without universal condemnation. It acknowledges that staying required extraordinary courage, that fleeing was human response to overwhelming threat. The warriors who fled aren't portrayed as valueless cowards, though obviously the poem favours those who stayed. They're portrayed as men who made different calculations about their survival odds. Legal codes from the period addressed cowardice in battle, specifying punishments for those who fled, which tells us fleeing was common enough to require systematic legal response. The laws wouldn't bother addressing rare behaviour. Cowardice in battle was apparently common enough to be predictable, normal enough to need standard punishments, human enough that legislators understood they needed to create incentives to stay beyond the immediate calculation of survival odds. So when we think about Viking Age courage, we should think not primarily about fighting skill, but about psychological endurance, the ability to stand in formation watching friends die, knowing you might be next, maintaining discipline despite every instinct screaming at you to run. That's where real courage lived, not in the weapon work, which was largely mechanical once combat began, but in the waiting and witnessing, in staying when leaving looked rational, in closing gaps as friends fell and continuing to stand knowing the gap might next be yours. Not all warriors had this courage. Probably most didn't, if we're honest about human psychology. The ones who stood when others fled, who maintained formation despite casualties, who watched horror unfold and chose to remain despite the option to flee. These were genuinely brave, not because they swung weapons skillfully, but because they mastered fear while surrounded by reasons to give in to it. And even they sometimes broke, sometimes fled, sometimes reached their psychological limits and ran. Not because they were weak, but because they were human, and humans watching friends die while waiting their turn eventually break. The mystery isn't why some fled. The mystery is why any stayed at all. Chapter 19. Breaking. When shield walls collapsed. Let us examine the critical moment in most Viking Age battles, when shield wall cohesion failed, when the formation that protected individual warriors dissolved into chaos. This moment, the breaking, is when most killing actually happened, when casualties spiked dramatically, when organised combat transformed into massacre. Understanding why and how shield walls broke reveals why formation discipline was paramount, why warriors who maintained position were valued over warriors with superior individual skill, and why battles could turn suddenly from standoff to slaughter in seconds. The breaking wasn't usually gradual degradation. It was catastrophic failure. Formations that seemed solid one moment collapsing completely the next, triggering chain reactions that killed more men in minutes than hours of standoff combat preceding it. Shield walls broke for various reasons, often multiple factors combining. Sometimes a critical warrior fell, a leader, an experienced fighter anchoring a section of line, and the gap his death created couldn't be closed before enemies exploited it. Sometimes one section of line was weaker than others, composed of younger or poorer equipped warriors who couldn't maintain the same intensity, and that weak point crumbled under sustained pressure. Sometimes it was exhaustion. One side reached collective physical limits first, couldn't maintain shield discipline, and individual failures cascaded into formation collapse. Sometimes it was psychological. Casualties reached the threshold where fear overcame discipline, a few men at the edges stepped backward, others followed, and suddenly the entire line was moving rearward in growing disorder. Whatever the immediate cause, the result was the same. A unified defensive formation became a collection of individuals, and individuals without formation protection died quickly. The skeletal evidence for breaking-related deaths is distinctive and disturbing. Archaeological remains from routing situations show injury patterns concentrated on backs, shoulders, backs of skulls, places you get hit when fleeing, when running away from enemies. These aren't combat wounds in the usual sense. These are pursuit and execution wounds, strikes against warriors who'd turned to flee, who were struck from behind as they ran. The archaeology from sites associated with routing is particularly grim. Bodies showing multiple wounds to backs, blade marks on shoulder blades, cuts to back of necks and skulls. These men weren't killed in face-to-face combat. They were cut down while fleeing, struck from behind by enemies who caught them, or by their own panicked comrades trampling. Some sites show bodies in positions suggesting they were crawling when killed, or had fallen and been struck repeatedly while trying to rise. These deaths weren't quick or clean, they were desperate and ugly, men dying while trying to escape violence that pursued them. The pursuit phase after a shield wall broke was when casualties became extreme. Historical accounts from various medieval battles suggest that the pursuit killed far more than the actual fighting. Once one side broke and ran, once formation discipline evaporated, the breaking side lost all advantages that made shield wall combat survivable. You couldn't defend yourself properly while running. Your shield bounced on your arm, your weapon was dead weight, your focus was on fleeing, not fighting. The pursuing side had every advantage. They could strike at exposed backs. They had psychological momentum. Their formation remained intact, allowing them to catch isolated fleeing individuals. And pursuers were often brutal. Accounts describe systematic killing of fleeing enemies, no quarter given, strikes delivered to backs and necks and skulls of men trying desperately to escape. Archaeologically, we find evidence of fleeing warriors cut down perhaps hundreds of yards from the main battle site, having run considerable distance before being caught and killed. It's deeply sobering to think about what breaking meant for individual warriors. You'd maintained discipline, stood in line despite casualties, done everything right, and then something beyond your control happened. Maybe the man beside you panicked and stepped back. Maybe a section of a line to your left collapsed, and enemies poured through. Maybe you'd simply reached exhaustion first and couldn't hold position anymore. Whatever the reason, the formation broke, and suddenly you were exposed, vulnerable, running because staying meant certain death. But running offered little better. You were weighted down with equipment, exhausted from fighting, pursued by enemies who were organised and motivated by victory. Your chances of survival dropped catastrophically. Most deaths in Viking Age battles probably occurred during and after breaks, not during the organised shield wall phase. The boring standoff was survivable. The exciting chaos of breaking and pursuit was when men died en masse. And the cruelest irony, you might have stood bravely for the entire battle, maintained perfect discipline, done everything warriors were supposed to do, and still died running because something beyond your control broke the formation. Your courage and skill became irrelevant the instant cohesion failed. Not heroic, not satisfying, narratively. But apparently true. Most Viking Age warriors who died in battles probably died fleeing, or in the immediate chaos of formation collapse. Killed not by superior enemies in honest combat, but caught in the catastrophic failure of collective discipline that transformed organised warfare into murder of those too slow to escape. Chapter 20. The Aftermath. Killing the wounded now. We must discuss what happened after the fighting stopped, when one side had broken and fled or been defeated, when the battlefield was covered with bodies, some dead, many wounded, some simply exhausted and unable to move. This is where warfare transitions from combat to something darker, because the aftermath involved systematic decisions about who would be allowed to survive and who would be killed. Let us be clear about the problem. Wounded enemies represented potential threats. They might recover, seek revenge, rejoin enemy forces. Medieval warfare had no Geneva Conventions, no established rules about treating enemy wounded humanely, no expectation that survivors would be spared. The practical solution was often systematic killing of enemy wounded, going through the battlefield after organised fighting ended, and ensuring that men who lay helpless were made permanently harmless through death. The skeletal evidence for this practice is extensive and disturbing. Archaeological sites associated with Viking Age battles show patterns of coup de grace wounds. Killing strikes delivered to already wounded warriors, additional trauma that served no purpose except ensuring death. We find skulls with multiple wounds, initial combat wounds that likely incapacitated the warrior, then additional deliberate strikes to the head that would have been fatal. Ridgeway Hill, discussed earlier, shows particularly systematic evidence. 54 men, many showing wounds consistent with being helpless when killed. Systematic beheadings suggesting organised execution rather than combat deaths. These weren't warriors killed during fighting. These were defeated men, possibly prisoners, systematically killed after combat ended. The archaeology from multiple sites shows similar patterns. Bodies with wound sequences that suggest they were injured, fell, and then were killed with methodical strikes while helpless. Saga literature treats post-combat killing as unremarkable, barely worthy of comment. There are passages describing warriors going through the slain and killing any who still moved, or finishing the wounded with no moral judgment attached. This was apparently standard practice, expected behaviour after battles, unremarkable enough that saga writers don't dwell on it. Legal codes draw distinctions between honourable combat death and killing after falling, in contexts where the killer faced legal consequences, suggesting that killing helpless opponents could be prosecuted but required proof of helplessness. If you could argue the victim might have recovered and fought again, the killing was justified. This legal framework only makes sense in a culture where killing wounded enemies was normal enough to require systematic legal accommodation. The question wasn't whether to kill wounded enemies, but whether specific killings crossed lines into murder rather than legitimate warfare aftermath. The practical reality was probably that non-combatants, teenagers too young to fight, older men past fighting age, camp followers, did much of the post-battle killing work. Professional warriors didn't need to spend time finishing wounded when there were spoils to collect, enemy soldiers to pursue, tactical situations to manage. But someone needed to ensure enemy wounded didn't survive to cause problems, and the work was delegated to whoever was available. Archaeological evidence can't tell us who delivered killing strikes, but the systematic nature of some post-combat killing, the methodical beheadings at Ridgeway Hill, the consistent patterns of finishing wounds across multiple sites, suggests organised rather than random violence. Someone was directing the work, ensuring it was done thoroughly. This transforms our image of post-battle scenes. Not just warriors resting after combat, but systematic processing of casualties, people moving through fields of wounded deciding who lives and who dies, delivering strikes to helpless men who might have survived with treatment. It's profoundly disturbing to imagine this from the perspective of wounded warriors. You've survived the battle itself, taken wounds that hurt but might heal, lying on ground watching the sky, hoping for rescue by your comrades. Then you see figures approaching, not friends coming to help, but enemies with weapons, systematically moving through the fallen. You're helpless, unable to defend yourself, and you watch them kill the man next to you, then approach you. Maybe you beg, maybe you try to bargain, maybe you just wait knowing what's coming. The strike falls, and your story ends not in heroic combat, but in helpless execution, killed after defeat by someone who might not even be a warrior, just someone tasked with ensuring enemy wounded don't survive. This isn't how saga literature portrays death in battle. Sagas give us heroic last stands, meaningful deaths in combat, warriors who fall with weapons in hand. But archaeology suggests many, perhaps most, battlefield deaths were uglier, men killed while helpless, after fighting ended, by finishers tasked with making victory permanent through systematic execution. Not glorious, not honourable, but apparently standard practice in Viking Age warfare, unremarkable enough that contemporary sources barely comment on it, just another aspect of warfare's unglamorous reality that popular culture prefers to ignore. Chapter 21. Weapon Quality and Social Class. We must return to economics one final time, because weapon quality wasn't just about craftsmanship, it was about social class determining survival chances in ways that courage couldn't overcome. Popular culture suggests all Viking weapons were quality crafted, that the metalworking skill of the age produced uniformly effective tools. Archaeological metallurgical analysis reveals something far grimmer, dramatic variation in weapon quality corresponding directly to the wealth of the burial the weapon came from. Poor weapons used low-carbon iron that bent easily, showed poor forge welding with internal weaknesses, had inadequate heat treatment leaving them soft and prone to damage. Rich weapons showed higher carbon content, better forge work, proper hardening and tempering, superior construction throughout. And in combat, these quality differences meant the difference between weapons that functioned reliably and weapons that failed when lives depended on them. The specific failures of poor quality weapons are documented archaeologically and in saga accounts. Spearheads made from inadequate iron bent on impact, rendering them useless after a few strikes. We find archaeological examples of bent spear points, clear evidence they deformed during use and were discarded as battlefield waste. Sword edges made from low-carbon iron rolled rather than cutting cleanly, losing their edge after a few strikes against shields or armour. The Mastermere find, that 10th century tool chest from Gotland, contained broken swords and damaged weapon parts, suggesting a market for repairing failed weapons. Shield bosses made from thin iron separated from shield boards under stress, leaving warriors with perforated shields. These failures weren't rare accidents. They were predictable outcomes of using poor quality equipment made from inadequate materials by smiths with limited skill or resources. And the poorest warriors got the worst equipment because that's all they could afford. What makes this truly brutal is the combat calculus. In battle, poor weapons failed against better equipment. Your low-quality spear bent striking the well-made shield of a wealthy opponent, while his quality spear point punched through your poorly constructed shield. Your sword edge rolled, striking his mail shirt, which you couldn't afford, while his better sword maintained its edge cutting through your wool tunic. Class determined not just whether you owned weapons, but whether those weapons functioned adequately under stress. Archaeological analysis of grave goods shows clear correlation. Wealthy burials, judged by overall grave goods quality, contain weapons showing superior metallurgy, while poor burials contain weapons showing inferior construction and materials. The richest warriors didn't just have more weapons. They had weapons that worked better when both their lives and their opponents' lives depended on weapon performance. Saga literature occasionally acknowledges this reality, though usually indirectly. There are accounts of warriors whose weapons failed at critical moments, swords bending, spears breaking, and these failures determine battle outcomes. The saga accounts usually frame weapon failure as bad luck or fate, but when we understand the metallurgical reality, we can read these as class narratives, poor warriors whose inferior equipment failed them. Legal codes also reflect quality variation. Compensation for killing varied based on the victim's social status, but also based on whether quality weapons were lost. A wealthy man killed in full armour with an expensive sword generated higher compensation than a poor farmer killed with a cheap spear, partly because the material loss was greater. This only makes sense in a society where weapon quality varied so dramatically that legal systems needed to account for it in standardized ways. So when we picture Viking Age battles, we should imagine not just wealthy and poor fighting side by side, but wealthy and poor fighting with equipment of dramatically different quality. The wealthy warrior's expensive weapons and armour gave him tangible combat advantages, not just protection, but weapons that functioned reliably when poor weapons failed. The poor warrior knew this, knew his spear might bend on impact, knew his shield might not hold, knew the wealthy opponent facing him had better equipment that increased survival odds. Courage couldn't fully compensate for inferior gear. Skill couldn't overcome weapons that bent or broke. And when battles ended, the survivors were disproportionately wealthy, not necessarily because they were braver or more skilled, but because their equipment was better, and better equipment improved survival chances. Class determined survival in ways that make Viking Age warfare less about individual merit and more about economic access to functional tools, not heroic, not based on courage or skill alone, but apparently true. Being poor meant fighting with inferior weapons that might fail you, and weapon failure in combat usually meant death. Chapter 22. Looting the Dead. The real reason for battle. Let us be honest about Viking Age warfare's economic motivations. Saga literature gives us honour, glory, revenge as battle motivations, and these mattered certainly. But the immediate practical motivation for much Viking Age warfare was simpler and more unglamorous. Profit through looting. After battles ended, systematic stripping of corpses began. Armour, weapons, jewellery, clothing, even shoes. Everything valuable was taken from the dead. This wasn't occasional opportunistic theft. This was systematic economic activity, expected aftermath of warfare. The reason many men participated in raids and battles. The violence was means to an end, and the end was acquiring wealth through taking it from those who could no longer object. Understanding this economic dimension transforms how we see Viking Age warfare, not primarily about honour or glory, but about resource extraction through violence. The basic economics are stark. Equipment was expensive, and corpses no longer needed their equipment. A dead warrior, wearing mail armour, represented hundreds of hours of skilled labour lying on the ground, available to whoever reached it first. A sword was months or years of income in portable form. Quality shields, helmets, spears, axes, knives, all valuable, all reusable, all there for the taking if you survived and the corpse's owner hadn't. Archaeological evidence shows this practice clearly. Warrior burials often lack grave goods that should be present. We find warriors buried without weapons, suggesting weapons were looted before burial. We find wealthy burials missing obvious items, a wealthy man buried with expensive jewellery but no weapons, suggesting weapons were valuable enough to be retained by survivors even when other grave goods were buried. The absence tells us that looting was common enough that even valued community members might be buried without their full equipment, if that equipment was useful to survivors. The dark reveal here is that your own dead were also looted systematically by your own survivors. Laws attempted to prevent this, requiring that dead warriors' equipment go to their heirs, rather than being claimed by fellow warriors who survived. The fact that laws addressed this tells us it was common enough to be problematic. Imagine the scene. Battle ends. Your side has won, or at least survived. The field is covered with dead, including friends and relatives. The systematic looting begins, and survivors take equipment from everyone, enemy and friend alike, because valuable equipment lying on corpses serves no purpose, and someone needs it. Maybe you justify it. He's dead. He doesn't need this mail shirt, but I'm alive and fighting without armour. He'd want me to have it. Maybe there's no justification needed, just pragmatic resource allocation. Either way, bodies are stripped with same efficiency regardless of which side they fought on. There's a secondary economy we can infer: battlefield scavenging by non-combatants. After battles, local people would come to collect whatever warriors hadn't taken, damaged equipment that could be repaired, scraps of metal, fabric, leather, anything useful. Some archaeological finds suggest this. Caches of broken weapons found away from main battle sites, suggesting someone collected battlefield scrap and hid it for later processing. The economics make sense. A damaged mail shirt is still valuable for the iron rings that can be reused. A broken sword can be reforged into smaller items. Even the bodies had economic value. Clothes could be scavenged, leather shoes taken, anything that could be reused or repurposed. The battlefield was a temporary free market where everything had value, and traditional ownership claims were void, governed only by who arrived first and could take what they wanted. So when we ask, why did Vikings fight? The answer includes unglamorous economic reality. Fighting created opportunities to acquire valuable equipment from corpses. Success in battle meant profit through looting, potentially years' worth of wealth collected in hours if you survived and the battle went well. This isn't how saga literature frames warfare. Sagas talk about honour and reputation and glory. But the economic activity around battles, the systematic looting, the laws attempting to regulate equipment distribution, the archaeological evidence of stripped corpses, all point to warfare as economic activity with violence as the means of wealth transfer. Most warriors who participated in battles probably fought for some combination of obligation, reputation, and economic opportunity. The obligation kept them in line during the boring, terrifying parts. The reputation motivated heroic action that sagas celebrated. But the economic opportunity, the knowledge that victory meant potentially acquiring equipment worth more than years of farming, that was practical motivation that kept people showing up for battles despite the trauma and danger. Not romantic. Not the stuff of heroic poetry. But probably more influential than poetry admits, because while honour and glory feel good, armour and weapons and silver have tangible value that feed families and improve status in ways that stories about your courage cannot. Chapter 23. When battles went wrong. Trapped, slaughtered, routed. We've discussed normal battle outcomes, but we should examine disasters. What happened when battles went catastrophically wrong? When armies found themselves trapped, surrounded, overwhelmed, facing not just defeat but annihilation. These scenarios reveal warfare at its worst, where the normal survival strategies failed, where maintaining discipline and courage mattered less than sheer luck or mercy that often wasn't forthcoming. Archaeological mass graves preserve evidence of these disasters, sites where defeated forces were slaughtered en masse, where the dead show wound patterns indicating they were trapped or helpless when killed, where the scale of death suggests something beyond normal combat outcomes. Understanding these disasters means understanding that Viking Age warfare could go very wrong very quickly, transforming battles into massacres. The scenarios that produced disasters varied: ambushes where one force was caught unprepared, betrayals where supposed allies turned on you mid-battle, overwhelming numerical odds where your side was simply outnumbered beyond any chance, terrain traps where retreat routes were blocked, leaving armies surrounded. In any of these situations, normal combat calculations changed. Maintaining formation discipline didn't help if you were surrounded with no retreat path. Fighting bravely didn't improve survival odds if enemies outnumbered you 5-1. The normal rules, hold formation, maintain courage, fight until enemy breaks, became irrelevant when the battle was already lost, and the only question was whether enemies would offer quarter or pursue complete annihilation. Archaeological evidence suggests annihilation was common. Defeated forces weren't just beaten, they were destroyed, survivors hunted down and killed, corpses left unburied or thrown into mass graves. Ridgeway Hill illustrates this perfectly. 54 young men, likely Vikings based on radiocarbon dating and context, all violently killed and dumped in a mass grave with many beheaded. The wound pattern suggests these weren't combat deaths from a normal battle. They're execution wounds, systematic killing of defeated or captured men. The scenario might have been a Viking raiding party caught by Anglo-Saxon defenders, surrounded or trapped, defeated and captured, then systematically executed. None of the normal survival strategies would have helped once the situation deteriorated to that point. Maintaining courage meant dying bravely but still dying. Trying to flee meant being cut down while running. Surrendering meant, evidently, systematic beheading. The men in that mass grave probably understood, as the situation collapsed around them, that they were going to die regardless of what they did, that no action could save them, that their only remaining choices were about how rather than whether they died. The psychological horror of these situations is difficult to overstate. In normal battles, you had agency, maintain discipline, fight well, you improve survival odds. In disaster situations, agency evaporated. The battle was lost. You were trapped or surrounded or overwhelmed, and your fate rested on enemy decisions about whether to offer quarter. If they chose massacre, which archaeological evidence suggests was common, then nothing you did mattered. You could beg, you could fight desperately, you could try to flee, outcomes were the same. There are saga accounts describing these situations, warriors knowing they're doomed, choosing to die fighting because it's marginally better than waiting for execution. The fatalism of men who understand the battle has gone wrong beyond any recovery. The sagas usually focus on exceptional warriors who died bravely in these circumstances. But archaeology shows us the reality. Mass graves full of young men who died in disasters, their bones showing wounds that suggest they were butchered rather than defeated in honourable combat. It's sobering to remember that this was always a possibility. Every battle could potentially go catastrophically wrong. The ambush you didn't detect, the betrayal you didn't anticipate, the overwhelming force you couldn't retreat from, and when it went wrong, when you realised too late that you were trapped and doomed, courage and skill became irrelevant. You were going to die in the next hours, probably badly, and nothing could change that outcome. This wasn't rare. We have multiple archaeological sites showing massacre evidence, mass graves of defeated warriors, scales of death suggesting systematic slaughter rather than combat casualties. For every saga hero who died gloriously in hopeless last stands, how many died in anonymous? Massacres, dumped in pits, their stories lost because nothing about their deaths was glorious enough to merit recording? The boring history that archaeology reveals. Disasters were common, massacres were normal, and when battles went wrong, most warriors died in ways saga literature doesn't celebrate because there's nothing heroic about being trapped and slaughtered. No honour in being beheaded after capture and dumped in a mass grave with dozens of others who died the same unglamorous death. Chapter 24. Winter campaigns, frozen weapons, frozen bodies. Let us consider seasonal dimensions of Viking Age warfare, because climate shaped combat in ways popular culture ignores. Northern European winters were brutal, and are still brutal if you've experienced them, with temperatures well below freezing, snow and ice making movement difficult, shortened daylight reducing fighting hours. Yet warfare didn't stop for winter. Armies campaigned, battles happened, violence continued despite conditions that made combat even more miserable than usual. Winter warfare brought specific problems unknown in summer campaigns. Metal weapons and armour conducted cold to skin, causing frostbite where they touched flesh. Frozen ground made footing unstable, shield walls difficult to maintain. Numb hands couldn't grip weapons effectively. Exhausted warriors couldn't generate body heat, leading to hypothermia even while fighting. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were survival threats that operated alongside combat dangers, killing warriors through exposure as effectively as enemy weapons. The basic problem was metal and cold. Iron and steel conduct cold extremely efficiently. Touch metal that's been outside in winter, and your skin freezes to it almost instantly. Now imagine wearing metal armour in winter, or gripping metal weapon hilts, or having metal shield bosses against your hand. The contact points would cause frostbite within minutes of exposure. Warriors had to wrap metal contacts with fabric or leather, but this reduced grip security on weapons made armour less effective against moisture that turned to ice, created problems that summer warfare didn't involve. Hands were particularly vulnerable. You needed bare or minimally covered hands to grip weapons properly, but exposed skin froze quickly. Numb fingers couldn't grip reliably, leading to warriors dropping weapons or losing shield control because their hands no longer functioned properly. This wasn't a matter of toughness. You can't will frozen hands to maintain grip strength they don't have. Winter battles had unique horrors beyond normal combat trauma. Warriors wounded in summer might bleed out or die from shock, but winter wounded faced additional threat: freezing to death before bleeding out. A warrior who fell with wounds that might be survivable with treatment, broken leg, non-fatal cuts, disabled arm, would freeze on the ground while waiting for help that might not come before hypothermia killed him. Saga accounts mention winter battles where more men died from exposure than wounds, and this makes perfect sense. Fall on frozen ground, become unable to move from injury or exhaustion, and winter kills you within hours regardless of whether wounds were fatal. There are archaeological remains showing evidence of frostbite, bone changes associated with repeated cold exposure, particularly in extremities. Warriors who survived winter campaigns carried permanent frostbite damage, missing toes or fingers, frost-damaged ears and noses, marks of exposure that affected them for life. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of winter warfare was what happened after battles. Winners might survive the fighting only to freeze marching home. The scenario: you've fought, you're exhausted, your clothing is soaked with sweat and possibly blood, temperatures are below freezing, your body is depleted, unable to generate sufficient heat, and you must march to shelter before hypothermia kills you. Archaeological evidence suggests this was real risk. There are saga accounts of warriors dying from exposure after winning battles, freezing while trying to reach safety. Their victory meaningless because winter killed them anyway. Defeated warriors faced even worse odds, fleeing in winter, exhausted, wounded, without supplies or shelter. Many must have frozen during retreat. Their bodies left where they fell to be discovered in spring thaws. The archaeological record can't always distinguish warriors who died from combat versus exposure, but the seasonal timing of some finds suggests winter deaths from a combination of trauma and hypothermia. So when we picture Viking Age warfare, we should include winter's dimension. The additional misery of fighting in cold that numbed hands and froze exposed skin, the metal weapons that conducted cold to flesh, the frozen ground that made movement treacherous, the hypothermia that threatened winners and losers alike after fighting ended. Combat was already exhausting and terrifying. Add winter conditions and it became almost unbearable. The fact that warfare happened anyway, that men fought in these conditions when they could have waited for spring, tells us either that military necessity didn't respect seasons, or that winter campaigns offered advantages, catching enemies unprepared, moving when they expected respite, exploiting frozen waterways for movement. But for individual warriors, winter warfare meant fighting under conditions that added another layer of suffering to an already miserable experience. Not heroic, not glorious, just additional ways that Viking Age combat could kill you, now including freezing to death before, during or after the violence, dying from winter as much as from enemies, your courage and skill irrelevant against climate that killed regardless of bravery. Chapter 25. The Archaeology of Mass Graves. Let us end where we began, with evidence, with archaeology, with what bones and mass graves tell us about Viking Age combat. Because ultimately, everything we've discussed tonight comes from the unglamorous work of archaeologists excavating battle sites, examining skeletal remains, cataloguing wounds and trauma patterns, reconstructing what actually happened during Viking Age warfare. The mass graves are our most direct evidence, places where defeated forces were buried hastily, or victorious armies disposed of their own dead, sites that preserve bodies in contexts that allow systematic analysis. These graves give us what saga literature cannot: actual wounds on actual bones, statistical patterns across populations, evidence of what really happened to warriors when weapons met flesh and bone. Understanding these mass graves means understanding the reality behind the myths. Visby in Gotland remains the most extensively studied mass grave, though it dates to 1361, slightly outside our period, but using essentially Viking Age tactics. The 200-plus bodies buried there show systematic patterns. Most are male, ages ranging from teenagers to middle age with concentration in 20s and 30s, many still wearing armour that didn't save them. The wound analysis is devastating. Multiple blade marks on skulls, even on skulls protected by mail coifs. Cuts to bones throughout bodies, evidence of multiple strikes to same individuals. What Visby teaches us is scale. Warfare killed in mass quantities, young men primarily, and equipment didn't guarantee survival. The archaeological analysis reveals that even wealthy warriors wearing expensive armour died in large numbers, suggesting that no amount of equipment could protect against overwhelming numbers or sufficient violence. The grave also shows something else: hasty burial, bodies thrown into pits with minimal ceremony, suggesting the winners didn't have time or inclination for proper individual burials. Mass graves weren't honourable, they were expedient disposal of large numbers of dead. Ridgeway Hill shows us something different: systematic execution. 54 individuals, all young males, all violently killed with beheading as common cause of death, buried in a mass grave with signs of disrespect. Heads placed incorrectly or missing, bodies tumbled together without care. This isn't a battle grave, it's an execution site, showing us what happened to defeated forces who were captured rather than killed in combat. The systematic nature of the killing, multiple beheadings, consistent wound patterns, evidence of methodical violence, suggest this was organised, not spontaneous rage. Someone gave orders, someone carried them out efficiently. The bodies were disposed of carelessly afterward, suggesting the victims' humanity was irrelevant to those who killed them. This is warfare's aftermath stripped of any heroic pretense. Captured men systematically killed and buried in a pit, their deaths unremarkable enough that the grave went unmarked until accidentally discovered centuries later. Repton shows us logistics. A Viking, army overwintering in 873-874, left 264 burials, many showing violent trauma, evidence of the costs of sustained campaign. The interesting aspect of Repton is what it reveals about Viking armies as functioning organisations. They overwintered, which meant setting up camps, providing for hundreds of warriors over months, dealing with disease and injuries and normal deaths alongside combat casualties. The burial context shows organisation. Warriors buried together, some with grave goods, some without. Patterns suggesting social hierarchy even in death. The site reminds us that warfare wasn't just battles. It was sustained operations requiring logistics, and those operations killed through disease and accident as much as through combat. The unglamorous reality of military campaigns. People died from dysentery and pneumonia and accidents, not just from heroic combat, and these deaths required burial just like combat deaths. What these mass graves collectively reveal is unglamorous scale. Warfare killed young men in large numbers, disposed of bodies with varying degrees of care, left behind evidence that archaeology can read centuries later. The bones don't lie about how people died. The wound patterns, trauma sequences, evidence of violence preserved in skeletal remains. We can distinguish combat wounds from execution wounds, sudden deaths from slow deaths, honourable burials from expedient disposal. And what the bones tell us consistently is that Viking Age warfare was less about individual heroism and more about industrial-scale violence against young male bodies, most of whom died in ways that weren't heroic enough to merit saga accounts, but were common enough to fill mass graves. These men had names, lives, families who mourned them. They died in violence that archaeology preserves but popular culture sanitizes, their bones showing trauma that cinema dramatizes but makes palatable, their actual deaths far less clean and far less meaningful than the heroic deaths we create in fiction. This is boring history's final lesson. The bones preserve unglamorous truth, and the truth is that most Viking Age warriors who died in battle did so in ways that weren't particularly heroic, weren't individually memorable, left behind nothing but anonymous bones in mass graves that tell us they died young, violently, and without the glory that makes deaths worthy of saga literature. Just young men who died, whose bones we can examine, whose wounds we can catalogue, whose actual experiences were far darker and far less romantic than anything popular culture depicts. So here we are, dear listener, 25 chapters into the reality of Viking Age combat, and I hope you can see now why popular culture gets it so spectacularly wrong. There were no dramatic one-on-one sword duels with warriors circling each other like honourable opponents in some grand test of skill. There were no berserkers charging shirtless through enemy lines, immune to pain, cleaving through dozens of foes with supernatural strength. There were no warriors casually dual-wielding axes, spinning and slicing with impossible grace. What there was, what archaeology and careful historical analysis reveal, was far more unglamorous and far more disturbing than anything Hollywood has produced. What there was, exhausted farmers with poor quality weapons, standing shoulder to shoulder in suffocating human walls, jabbing spears over shields in monotonous repetition until their arms burned and someone broke. The violence was brief, often just minutes of actual weapon swinging after hours of tense standoff. The killing was ugly, accumulating shallow wounds, men bleeding out slowly, infection setting in days later to finish what the initial thrust started. The equipment was often inadequate. Swords that bent, spears that broke, shields that splintered, mail armour that most couldn't afford. The deaths were rarely heroic. Men killed while fleeing, executed after capture, finished while lying wounded, dying slowly from infections that medieval medicine couldn't treat. Most warriors weren't professional soldiers with systematic training. They were farmers conscripted or obligated by social ties, with minimal preparation and whatever equipment they could afford or borrow. They stood in shield walls because breaking and running meant being cut down from behind, because there was no alternative between standing with your community or abandoning it. Most died not from heroic combat, but from being too poor to afford good armour, too exhausted to keep their shields up, too unlucky to avoid the spear thrust that punctured something vital. And if they survived the initial wound, they faced weeks of potential infection, fever, gangrenous rot, dying slowly in ways that make instant death in battle look merciful by comparison. The gap between myth and reality couldn't be wider. Cinema gives us heroes and glory. Archaeology gives us mass graves full of young men with multiple wounds, beheading marks, evidence of violence that was systematic and industrial rather than individual and heroic. Saga literature gives us named warriors and meaningful deaths. Archaeology gives us anonymous bones that tell us they died badly, without the glory that makes deaths worthy of poetry. This is what boring history reveals when we strip away romanticism and look at evidence. Warfare was brutal, exhausting, terrifying, and most participants died in ways that weren't particularly heroic or memorable, just young and violent and permanent. But of course, there's one more thing to consider before we end tonight. We still do this, you know. We still romanticize warfare, still create myths about combat honour and heroic violence, still prefer comfortable fictions to uncomfortable realities. The details change. Modern warfare uses different weapons, different tactics, but the fundamental pattern remains the same. We create stories about war that emphasise individual heroism and meaningful sacrifice while minimising the unglamorous reality that most combatants are young people with minimal training, that most deaths are random rather than meaningful, that courage and skill matter less than we want to believe, that the actual experience is far more traumatic and far less noble than the stories we tell afterward. The Viking Age wasn't special in this regard. Every warrior culture throughout history has created heroic narratives that obscure the reality of violence. Roman historians wrote about legions and tactics while minimising the terror and trauma of individual soldiers. Medieval chroniclers wrote about battles and outcomes while glossing over the sensory horror and psychological cost. Modern war reporting focuses on strategy and politics, while the actual experience of combatants remains largely invisible to civilian populations who consume war as entertainment or distant news rather than immediate visceral reality. We need these myths, perhaps, because the reality is too disturbing to face directly. That warfare is young people killing and dying in confusion and terror, that most military violence is far less clean and purposeful than we prefer to imagine, that survivors carry trauma that heroic narratives can't accommodate. If there's a lesson in tonight's examination of Viking Age combat, it might be this. Be skeptical of any narrative that makes warfare seem glorious or honourable or meaningful. The reality preserved in archaeological evidence, the bones with multiple wounds, the mass graves, the evidence of execution and massacre alongside combat casualties, suggests that warfare is primarily about young people dying badly, regardless of the cultural context or historical period. The Vikings weren't unique in this. Their warfare was brutal, but so is all warfare when you strip away the myth-making and look at what actually happens to human bodies. The specific details change, weapons evolve, tactics develop, but the fundamental reality remains. Violence is traumatic, random, exhausting, and those who participate in it either die or survive with cost that heroic narratives minimise or ignore entirely. So perhaps the next time you encounter media depicting warfare, whether historical Vikings or modern soldiers, you might remember what bones tell us. That most deaths aren't heroic, that most combatants are terrified rather than brave, or brave despite terror rather than fearless. That equipment quality and social class determine survival odds as much as courage. That the sensory reality of combat, the sounds, smells, psychological strain, may be more traumatic than the physical violence. That systematic killing of wounded and defeated is common rather than exceptional. That infection and exposure kill as effectively as weapons. These realities don't fit comfortably in heroic narratives, so they're edited out, but they're what archaeology preserves. The boring, unglamorous truth beneath the myths. Yet there's something else I want to say before we truly end tonight's journey. Thank you for staying with me through all 25 chapters of this examination. I know it's been long, over 2 hours of methodical detail about a subject that popular culture treats very differently. We've taken what could have been an exciting topic, Viking warriors and their weapons, and systematically removed every element that makes it exciting, leaving only the unglamorous archaeological reality. No spinning axes, no dramatic duels, no berserker fury, just exhausted farmers with poor weapons, standing in suffocating formations, dying in ways that weren't heroic enough to merit saga accounts. This is what boring history does. Takes something that should be thrilling and reveals it was mostly miserable, mostly random, mostly far less meaningful than the myths we've built around it. If you've made it this far, if you're still listening as I wind down toward the end, then perhaps this approach works for you. Perhaps there's something soothing about methodical examination of historical detail, something calming about letting your mind focus on facts and evidence, rather than whatever thoughts usually circle when you're trying to rest. Or perhaps you simply appreciate knowing that someone, somewhere, is willing to spend hours examining the unglamorous reality beneath popular myths, revealing what bones and archaeology tell us about how people actually lived and died rather than how we wish they had. Either way, I'm grateful you're here, that you've given your time and attention to this long, detailed journey through Viking Age combat reality. We've covered so much tonight. The myths and their systematic dismantling, the economics of weapons and warfare, the actual techniques of shield wall combat, the wounds and trauma patterns, the psychology of standing in line while friends died, the aftermath of looting and execution, the disasters and winter campaigns, the archaeological evidence that preserves truth beneath mythology. Each chapter was 600 words of methodical detail, building slowly toward a comprehensive understanding of how Viking Age warriors actually used their weapons, which is to say, far less dramatically and far more grimly than cinema suggests. I hope it's been informative, I hope it's been thorough, and I hope, perhaps most importantly, that it's helped quiet whatever needed quieting in your mind tonight. But before true sleep finds you, let me offer one final thought. Picture, if you will, not the Viking battlefield, but wherever you are right now, your room, your bed, your safe and comfortable space. The temperature is just right, not the freezing cold of a Scandinavian winter where warriors froze while marching home from battles they'd survived. The air smells normal, neutral, not the overwhelming stench of fear sweat and blood and voided bowels that characterize shield wall combat. The sounds around you are peaceful, maybe silence, maybe gentle ambient noise, certainly not the screaming and impacts and breaking sounds of medieval warfare. You are safe, you are comfortable, you are warm and protected in ways that Viking Age warriors could scarcely imagine as they stood in wool tunics, holding wooden shields, knowing any moment might bring violence they couldn't adequately defend against. The horrors we've examined tonight, and they were horrors, let's be honest about that, are historical. They happen to real people, which makes them tragic, but they're not happening now. Not to you, not tonight. The young men who stood in shield walls, who took spear thrusts and died from infections, who were executed after capture or froze while fleeing. Their centuries gone, their suffering ended, their bones examined by archaeologists who try to understand and honour their experiences by revealing truth, rather than perpetuating myths. You are here, now, safe, and all those brutalities are historical data, information to be processed and understood rather than threats to be feared. The gap between their reality and yours is vast, unbridgeable by anything except imagination, and you can choose to let that imagination rest now. If you found value in tonight's long examination of boring history, if this methodical dismantling of Viking myths has helped quiet your mind, or provided the kind of detailed focus that eases you towards sleep, then I hope you'll return. There are many more corners of history to examine, many more myths to dismantle, many more hours of unglamorous detail to explore. You can find this channel again by subscribing, not for my sake, but for yours, so that when you need another night of boring history, when you need someone to methodically examine some aspect of the past that popular culture misrepresents, you can find your way back. But that's for another night. For now, for tonight, let the details we've explored settle in your mind like sediment, heavy and peaceful, pushing out other thoughts through sheer weight of historical fact. May your rest be deep and undisturbed, dear listener. May your dreams be free from shield walls and spear points, from the sounds of medieval combat and the smell of battlefields. May you wake refreshed, carrying with you the knowledge that you now understand Viking warfare better than most people ever will, not because you've watched exciting films or read heroic sagas, but because you've spent hours examining the unglamorous archaeological reality. That knowledge is yours now, permanent, a small piece of boring history that makes you slightly better informed about how our ancestors actually lived and died. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well, and thank you, truly, for spending this long evening with me, exploring the gap between Viking myths and Viking reality. Until next time, and there will be a next time, another topic, another myth to examine, another deep dive into boring history, rest peacefully. The battles are over. The warriors are long gone, and you are safe, here, now, in your comfortable